Hi everyone, Maddie Hale here. Merry Christmas, and I hope you're having a restful break and looking forward to the new year. Now, back on the 20th of January 2025, Donald Trump took office for his second term as President of the United States. Since then, we've kept you up to date with episodes of the Trump Report every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Now, as we take a short break for the festive season, let's look back over the last year at some of the biggest moments from the show and Donald Trump's presidency.
Today, I'm joined by David K. Johnston, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, professor at Rochester Institute of Technology, and author of an array of books on Donald Trump. I mean, if anyone knows the mind of Donald Trump, it is you, David. So thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Glad to be here.
As I mentioned, few have covered Donald Trump as much as you have. What do you make of his first few weeks in office so far?
Well, what's different this time around is that Donald has a staff of people who are dedicated to completely changing the United States, to suppressing in a much more severe way people of color, Muslims, anybody who isn't a white, straight male like me. The first time around, Donald didn't have those folks. And Donald is a terrible manager. He presents himself as a businessman, but he's really a cash extractor. Every business I've ever been able to investigate, with one exception, a very small exception, he never had any money invested in them. He'd borrow all the money, like to buy a casino. He'd take a multi-million-dollar fee off the top, which gave him a negative investment. And then he would drive his executives and managers crazy because he would keep interfering in the business in non-business-like ways. And once the business was no longer valid and collapsed, he would say, "Oh, what a genius I am for getting out of the market."
And that brings me on to the current situation with what he's saying about Gaza. We've heard him say that the US is going to take over Gaza, but then we heard, Marco Rubio and also Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, they both appeared to row back on those claims, saying that if it did happen, Palestinians would be temporarily resettled. But then even now today, Trump has doubled down on his resettlement proposal. What do you make of this and this disconnect between Trump and then the rest of his team? And what does that speak to about his negotiation styles, that deal-making style he has?
Well, first off, let me point out that I've negotiated with Donald many times, and he's easy to get the better of. When he hired Tony Schwartz to write his book, The Art of the Deal, typically pay for that back then would have been $50,000. He said, "I want half the royalties." And Trump said, "Okay." And he's a terrible negotiator. He just claims he is. And when it comes to Gaza, Donald is appallingly ignorant, just appallingly ignorant. He couldn't tell you the difference between a Sunni and a Shia if he had to. Now, I don't expect most people listening to this to know, but if you're the president of the United States, it's really crucial to understand that difference in the Muslim world. What he is proposing is essentially a war crime. And many places have been raising this. And the countries in the Middle East have uniformly said, where is that from? We're not doing that. And this goes to Donald's belief that whatever he says makes it so. He creates his own reality. Or as another way to think about this, he lives in a fictional world in his head where whatever he says, well, that's the way it is, which is why he can turn around on a dime and say, "Well, I never said that."
It's been classed as this shock and awe approach that we've seen from Trump, and we've seen him do it with saying that he's going to apply tariffs to Mexico and Canada, which hasn't actually happened yet. That deal has been put off for the moment. But we did see Mexico, for example, they have started putting troops on the border in response to that. And on the other hand, people point out the fact that his threats about leaving NATO, for example, that's actually pushed NATO allies towards increasing defense spending. Don't you think there needs to be some credit given to him on that approach that he has? I mean, it's unconventional, it's unpredictable, but it is sometimes getting Trump what he wants.
Well, in the case of Mexico, he didn't get anything, nor Canada. I mean, that's been well reported here in the U.S., in Canada, and in Mexico, that Donald claims he got something, but he really didn't get anything in those deals. His threats against NATO are consistent with his belief that Vladimir Putin is a wonderful person who we should embrace. And as he said in 2018 in Helsinki, he didn't trust any of the American intelligence agencies, but he trusted Vladimir Putin. I don't know what more you would need to know to understand that Donald is utterly gullible and ill-informed.
And we've heard today that the Democrats, they've announced some sort of plan to try and impeach Trump for these comments that he made about Gaza. They're accusing him of advocating for ethnic cleansing. In Trump's last term in office, he was impeached twice. He's also the first convicted felon to be serving as a US president. And even still, despite those facts, the majority of Americans still voted for him to be the US president. Do you think the Democrats are sort of clutching at straws here? Is it going to have any impact whatsoever over Trump and his reputation?
Well, first, let me address his victory. He won less than half the vote. He only won by a margin of 1.5 percentage points. That's not a mandate. You want to see a mandate, go back to Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1964, Ronald Reagan in 1984. He won by a very narrow margin, and he won principally because 13 million voters stayed home compared to the 2020 election. With population growth, there should have been 17 million more voters. Why do people stay home? Because they think the economy is doing well. And the American economy, as the magazine The Economist points out, is the marvel of the world. It's way better than anybody else coming out of the pandemic. And that's because of the policies Biden put in place to address these matters. So Donald benefits from the fact that the Democrats do not know how to communicate. The Republicans have had years and years of experience and training in how to say things in a way that viscerally touch people. The Democrats still speak in, well, blah, 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 blah. And by the way, footnote 47 on page 15 of my plan, they don't know how to connect with people. They've known this for a long time. And so they're being utterly ineffectual in opposing Trump. And there is not a single Republican on Capitol Hill who will vote to impeach Donald Trump.
As you mentioned, you've spoken to Donald Trump, you've spoken to him on the phone. You mentioned to us before that he's a very skilled person at reading people. He's good at picking up on clues on what appeals to people. I mean, if we go back to the Washington plane crash and we heard Trump's comments about blaming DEI initiatives, even though there isn't any evidence to support those claims they made. So, I mean, those claims were criticized by many people. He's called insensitive. Do you still think that he has that ability to read people, read the room?
Well, Donald has a larger goal here. Donald really has a serious issue about people who are not like him, white, straight males. And so every opportunity he has to move the country in the direction of a white supremacist, white-dominated culture, he is going to take, partly to reach out to his base. I do think that his ability to read the room has declined, and I think that's partly due to his advanced age. There are videos you can see of him signing executive orders where it's very clear he has no idea what he's signing, and even his responses are not on point. But also, now that he's in a second term as president, he feels invincible. And of course, he has talked in the past and said that the only mistake he made as president the first time was leaving the White House. He still has designs on being America's dictator, as I've been warning people for almost 10 years.
What you just said there about how he doesn't like people outside of that white male construct. I mean, some might argue that that's quite an extreme description of Trump. We saw him in his last presidency. He didn't go to those extreme lengths as you're suggesting. What is it about Trump that's suggesting to you that he is going to those lengths? What evidence do we have for that?
Well, first of all, I have a long history with Donald Trump, 37 years of meeting with him and digging documents out of the public record about who he really is, and establishing that he's been a career criminal and the third generation head of a fourth generation white collar crime family. White collar crime. We have a lot of white collar crime families, and law enforcement principles haven't caught up with that. But Donald believes and you can find many statements where he believes that, he's never done anything wrong in his life. He calls himself a Christian, but he's never asked God for forgiveness because he says he's never done anything that would require asking for forgiveness. And look what he's doing to the government right now. A group of young men who are not government employees are rummaging through and copying sensitive documents from the Treasury. They are in control now of the federal government system for paying all of its bills. These people aren't even government employees. And at the CIA, he has ordered that an email that is not encrypted be sent with the names of all the new hires. Now, not the full names, but if you're the Chinese or Iranian or Russian intelligence service, wow, what a gift. So he is behaving like someone who will never be held accountable.
I'd love to hear your thoughts about Trump's White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. She's very young, she's very fiery. But what do you make of her?
I think there he's probably made a smart choice. The last time around, he was going to move the press corps out of the White House, which they might do, although they did not. And he's got someone who's telegenic and who's clearly talented at mixing it up with reporters. She's also reinforcing every time she comes out the fundamental principle that Donald has long espoused. You should not be allowed to criticize or write negatively about him unless he approves of what you say. And that's a very clear message that comes from her, that she is not there to serve the office of the president. She's there to serve Donald personally.
And it is interesting because in the first week of Trump being in office, it's reported that he spent nearly 8 hours on camera in his first week. And then you compare that to his first week in his first presidency, he spent about 4 hours on camera. I mean, this is a man who's publicly denounced journalists. Why do you think that he's giving so much more camera time this time?
Well, first of all, he's not doing all the work a normal president would do. Barack Obama, who wrote his own books, unlike Donald, used to complain to staff, why did you only give me a 2-page single-spaced memo? I need 10 pages on this. And he would stay up late in the night studying issues so he was informed. So he has the time to do things like this. But secondly, because of the way Donald was raised, with his very cold, depressed, and distant mother and a father who was a monster. I mean, he took a little bit of money from a neighbor boy and then said, that's my money now. Donald has an empty vessel. He does not know joy or contentment or love, and he never will. I refer to his life as a variation of the film Groundhog Day, the comedy. This is Groundhog Day, the nightmare. He is trapped in this world where he's a 13-year-old boy going through puberty, which you'll see in the comments he makes about women and how he talks about them. And he needs to have attention and money to feel somehow inside that he is okay. He knows perfectly well that he's not. And what a miserable life. I have people who will email me or call me and say, well, obviously, you're jealous of Donald. Oh, no, not in the least. What a miserable life his family, commercial transactions, his wives, all 3 of them, commercial transactions. And a lot of people can't envision that, Joe. What do you mean it's a commercial transaction? There are lots of commercial marriages in the world.
So Peter Mandelson, he's the new British ambassador to the US. He said that actually Trump is the antidote for disenchanted Americans who feel that the system has let them down. What do you make of those comments?
No, I think the ambassador is exactly right. I wrote a series of best-selling books, started while I was still an investigative reporter at the New York Times, on how the bottom 90% of Americans have been horribly damaged by the economic policies of the last half century. Their incomes have gone nowhere. In fact, in 2016, the take-home pay of 90% of Americans only covered the first 42 weeks of the year compared to 1973. So the American economy has been turned into this system to stealthily take money from those below and move it up to the top. And in perfectly legal free lunch and the fine print, I document all of this. I spent years and years digging this out of the public record. And those were award-winning books that were used in some places as textbooks to explain what's happening. So Absolutely. Huge numbers of Americans are looking around saying, why was grandpa better off at my age than I am? Why was dad better off than I am at my age? Women have seen their wages rise against men, not because they're getting properly paid, but because men's wages have fallen if you don't have a college diploma or an advanced degree. So absolutely, Donald speaks to these people and they feel he is their champion, but his policies he's putting in place are going to harm them. They're clearly going to go after Medicaid, which insures 1 in 5 Americans. They're probably going to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And there are millions of Americans who believe that the Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act are separate things. They're the same thing. And you can see interviews with people, well, no, I want to get rid of Obamacare, but the Affordable Care Act, I desperately need that. They're going to get rid of that. They're going to stop negotiating drug prices and go back to $1,000 a month for insulin for diabetics, because this is a presidency of the rich, by the rich, for the rich.
That reminds me of the little tech billionaire bromance we're seeing at the moment with Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. I mean, what do you think about that?
You've seen all sorts of business owners come to heel because the federal government has enormous power to mess with their businesses. Elon Musk, first thing he did with no authority was get the head of the FAA to resign, a forced resignation. Lo and behold, the FAA is investigating one of Elon Musk's companies. Elon Musk's wealth depends on his federal contracts. So here you have someone with $13 billion in federal contracts removing the people who have found that he's not in compliance with those contracts. And the Democrats can't even articulate that clearly to the public. His relationships with people always are one-sided. Elon Musk will be free to do whatever he wants until the day comes that Donald says, gee, he's too much in the public eye, or he did something that upsets me, and then that will come apart. But in the meantime, the damage to the American economy is already underway.
My final question is, we've obviously heard a lot from Trump in the last few weeks. He's been doing a lot, making a lot of changes to policy, implementing new policies. But what for you has been the standout moment or the biggest surprise for you?
Oh, I think the real problem is that they've made it clear they're going to fire several thousand FBI agents for doing their job. The FBI is in charge of counterintelligence. They have stopped numerous terrorist plots, some of which we have not heard about and will not hear about because it's not in the national security interest of the country. They've made it clear that anyone who did any work on the investigations of Donald Trump, that is, they came to work and were told, go check this out, go get that document, they're on a potential firing list. If you want to benefit President Xi's ambitions to replace the U.S. in the world, if you want to help Vladimir Putin or the Iranians for that matter, then that's what you would be doing. And Donald isn't working to help them, but that's the effect of what he is doing. And it's because Donald really believes he should never be held accountable.
John Bolton, a former national security advisor under the Trump administration, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today. It is such a pleasure to have someone of your expertise on the show. I want to start timely with you. The Tate brothers, Andrew and Tristan, are on their way to the United States from Romania after the Trump administration reportedly pressured Romania to lift their travel ban. Now, these are two brothers that are charged with rape and human trafficking and convicted of tax evasion. From your standpoint, from a security standpoint, why would Donald Trump allow these two to come into the United States?
That's a question I can't answer. I'm absolutely stunned by this. I'm stunned that he had American officials contact Romanian officials at the Munich Security Conference some days back to ask about the possibility of getting the Tate brothers out. I just assumed leave them in Romania or leave them to Great Britain to prosecute for what they're charged with there. But it could be explained by Trump's fascination with getting Americans out of difficult circumstances, sometimes when they're hostages, sometimes, as in the case of a person who was arrested in Sweden for getting into an altercation, a famous rap star, that he wanted to get out of Swedish prison too. I didn't quite understand that, but that is a factor that you see in Trump's behavior.
Moving on to a different subject, John, this week we had French President Emmanuel Macron meet with Trump, where Donald Trump refused to say whether he thought Vladimir Putin was a dictator. And then in his first cabinet meeting yesterday, he said that Putin was smart and cunning, and continued to say that the war wouldn't have happened if he was president at the time. How dangerous do you think this kind of complimentary language is that Donald Trump uses about Vladimir Putin, or I guess the lack of condemnation?
Well, I think it's very, very serious, and it's a huge mistake for the United States and for the West as a whole. And you can see by the comments that he's made, by the actions the United States has taken, voting in the United Nations against a resolution condemning Russian aggression, U.S. voting alongside Russia, North Korea, Belarus. Even China didn't vote with Russia. They abstained on that resolution. So we're on the opposite side of the NATO alliance as a whole. And it's bad news for Ukraine, bad news for Ukraine's prospects, but bad news for NATO too, as he consistently drives wedges between the United States and its allies, and I don't see that diminishing. I've said for quite some time I'm very worried that Trump would completely withdraw the United States from NATO. He came close to it in 2018. He might well do it this time, or he might take steps that so weaken NATO that by the time he actually withdrew, it would just be a formality.
What was your reaction, your immediate reaction to when you saw the United States voting with Russia at that UN General Assembly?
Well, it was disgraceful. I mean, it's contrary to reality. It buys the Russian argument that NATO provoked the war by talking about Ukrainian membership. In fact, that's been the United States position since 2008, when George W. Bush proposed to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO on a fast track. So if that were provocative to Russia, one wonders why they didn't attack Ukraine before, why they waited to 2014 and then again in 2022. NATO has nothing to do with this. This is part of the design that Vladimir Putin has stated openly and publicly since 2005, when he said the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He's trying to put the Russian Empire back together again. Ukraine is a big part of that in his mind, and many, many other Russians. This is not just Putin's war, it really is a Russian war. And if you can't see that, then you're blinded to the steps you need to take to resist the aggression and to try and deter future aggression, whether it's by Russia in Europe or by China along its Indo-Pacific periphery.
Where do you see the state of the alliance right now, John, between Europe and the United States after a pretty insane few weeks?
Well, I think it's in trouble, and I think it's important for, particularly for NATO members who are also in the European Union, not reflexively to say, well, we can't count on the United States, we'll just have the European Union worry about defense. That isn't going to happen. That isn't enough. There's going to be a long period here of having to grit your teeth and bear with Donald Trump, try and distract him so he doesn't do more damage to NATO, in the hopes that when he disappears, he is an aberration and that we will snap back to a more normal policy. But it's going to be very, very dangerous for Ukraine. Zelensky comes to Washington on Friday, and he will obviously make another effort to try and keep the U.S. on side with Ukraine. And how well he does or how poorly he does could tell us a lot about what's going to happen once the real negotiations with Russia start.
When you see Donald Trump, the language that he uses when he's speaking about Vladimir Putin, kind of coupled with the fact that it's quite divisive right now between the US and its NATO members and Europe and everyone we thought were allies, basically, how do you think Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un are looking on at the situation? Do you think they're looking at Donald Trump looking as if there's a weak spot now?
Well, I think they've followed the war in Ukraine from the time it started, and especially now watching Trump. I think Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un all believe that they know how to manipulate Trump. They know he doesn't know very much. He doesn't care to know very much. He cares only about personal relations. He thinks everything in life is just another deal to be made. He doesn't have a grand strategy. He doesn't have a philosophy. He doesn't really even do policy. They're considering how they're going to take advantage of Trump in office, as they've seen Vladimir Putin take advantage of him by flattery and by releasing an American hostage, then having Belarus release an American hostage. This is the way that Putin is able to manipulate Trump, and I think Xi and Kim both think they can do it too.
This week, John, Trump unveiled a plan for selling a gold card visa, which would cost about $5 million and would essentially allow anyone wealthy to be able to purchase a permanent residency, which would in turn lead you on the path to citizenship in the United States. Now, a reporter asked Trump whether Russian oligarchs would be eligible to purchase a $5 billion gold visa, to which he kind of laughed and said, well, I don't know, possibly I know some pretty nice oligarchs. What was your reaction to this? It is such a bizarre backflip.
Right. Well, there are oligarchs, many of whose assets in Russia have been seized, who are not pro-Putin, but there are also a lot of them that still are pro-Putin. I'd like to know the ones he knows and why he thinks they're such good folks. And it will undoubtedly feed speculation about what exactly it is the oligarchs have on him. You know, many countries have programs that provide for visas and resident status for people who invest in the country. The U.S., that's the current program the U.S. has. It has many difficulties with it, but many European countries have it. Canada has a similar program. It takes a Donald Trump, though, basically to say, let's do it for $5 million and see who signs up. The one thing I can say is that every applicant for a U.S. visa gets a background check, fingerprints taken. You know, hopefully we will do the same for the people ponying up $5 million. Because if I were a terrorist group and I wanted to get people into the United States, or if I were an adversary of the United States that wanted more people with permanent resident status, I'd find a lot of $5 million checks to get those people in. So it may be a development that will help bring more investment into the United States. That's really what we should be looking for. But there's a danger there too. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely. John, tomorrow, as you mentioned, President Zelensky will be visiting the White House, where he said that he's set to sign this $500 billion minerals contract with Donald Trump. The problem being is that there is concern the contract doesn't include enough security for Ukraine from the United States. What kind of protection should Zelensky be asking for tomorrow when he meets with Donald Trump?
Well, I think this particular agreement, we don't know the details. I mean, there have been leaks of pieces of it. I must say, it sounds to me more like it's an agreement to agree. That is to say, there's not much in it. And it saves face for both Trump and Zelensky. The $500 billion figure, for example, is apparently not in the deal, which is what Trump was saying. So substantively, I'm not sure what this piece of paper they're going to sign will do. I think it's cosmetic and political for both of them. But if Zelensky, based on what happened with Macron and Starmer, is still of a view that he doesn't have a prospect of adequate security guarantees, particularly from the United States, that's going to be his central pitch to Trump. And I'm worried that he's going to fail, as I think Macron failed and Starmer may fail. As Trump said in his cabinet meeting yesterday, he thinks it's mostly for Europeans to make the security guarantees, which is evidence of a mindset that thinks that Europe's a long way away from the United States. And what happens in Europe, you know, it's like Neville Chamberlain talking about Czechoslovakia as a faraway country, which obviously it wasn't. Zelensky needs to find a way to appeal to Trump's ego, because that's always what's uppermost on Trump's mind. Don't talk about Ukraine security. Talk about what will benefit Donald Trump, what will enhance his reputation, and why selling out to Russia will harm his reputation, which it will in history, even though I'm quite sure at this moment Trump doesn't see that.
When it came to the 2024 presidential election, John, it was a hotly contested subject about how much aid the United States was sending, how much protection they were giving to Ukraine. Do you think that Donald Trump is basically keeping that in mind, that perhaps America does feel like this is Europe's problem, it's Europe's doorstep that Ukraine is on? So why would America have to always come to save other countries in strife?
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt Europe should be doing more. Britain has really been in the lead within Europe. Germany and others in what Donald Rumsfeld called Old Europe really have not. Poland, the Baltic republics have been very forthcoming in helping Ukraine. But, you know, the real question is, what's in America's interest? And it's been in our interest for a long time to have peace and stability in Europe for economic reasons, for our own security. That's what we get out of the NATO alliance. And it's not something you can say, well, we'll let the Europeans do it, and if they fail or if Ukraine fails, we don't care. We do care. If Russia comes to dominate Ukraine, it poses a bigger threat elsewhere in Europe to countries that are NATO members, to our economic interests, to a whole range of political and military interests. World's a complicated place. Donald Trump doesn't get the complications. Europe's right there with Ukraine, so it's Europe's problem. Sounds easy and straightforward. It's just completely wrong.
Tomorrow, when these two meet, when Trump and Zelensky meet, I know that we can't predict the future. We don't know exactly how this meeting will go, but how do you think the interaction will go with Zelensky, who's just been labeled a dictator and a moderately, I guess, successful comedian from the commander-in-chief of the United States?
Well, I'm very pessimistic about the outcome. You know, much of what Trump has said about Zelensky has been Russian propaganda. I remember in 2019, soon after Zelensky was actually elected, Trump had a conversation with Putin that I listened in on because that's part of my job, is to listen into all his conversations with heads of state. And Putin was deriding Zelensky. He said, we know him well in Russia. We watch his TV show with subtitles. And you know, he's an okay comedian. And it went on like that. And you could see Trump just eating it up, because here he had Putin criticizing Zelensky, with whom he had the famous perfect phone conversation that led to Trump's first impeachment. It goes back to Trump thinking, if I have good relations with somebody, the U.S. has good relations with the country, and if I have bad relations, the countries have bad relations. He still thinks somewhere in Ukraine, Hillary Clinton's computer server is being hidden that was used against him in the 2016 campaign. He's never gotten on with Zelensky because of the impeachment. I give Zelensky a lot of credit. He's tried very hard over the past 6 months to develop a relationship with Trump. From what I can see, I don't think he's succeeded. I think tomorrow could be the acid test.
Well, on the note of the relationships that Trump has, John, today Keir Starmer will be visiting Washington. You're someone that has spent a lot of time with Donald Trump, knowing his personality, knowing how he works with these big leaders. How do you think Keir Starmer should act towards Donald Trump in order to mend the relationship between the two countries, which is quite divisive right now?
Well, I think it's not a guaranteed way to succeed, but it's usually pretty likely to, is flatter him. Tell him how wonderful he is. Appeal to his ego, which is enormous. And again, as with Zelensky, explain why what you want, whatever Keir Starmer wants, Trump can be made to understand it will make him look good. Doesn't care about enhancing British security, doesn't really care about enhancing American security, cares about enhancing Donald Trump. This is hard for people to understand. It was hard for me to understand that he didn't think in policy terms, that he didn't have any kind of overarching concept what he thinks America's place in the world is. It's about Donald Trump's place in the world, and you know, people should approach it that way. If the objective is to get to the right result, then just think up an argument that you wouldn't make with any other leader in the world, but you could make with Donald Trump, because you would be playing to his ego.
Well, in that sense, John, is it fine to say that the peace deal between Russia and Ukraine will only be brokered because Donald Trump wants to get this done for his legacy, to say that he did this, whatever the outcome is?
Sure, he wants the Nobel Peace Prize. He has been upset ever since 2009 when Barack Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize, and to an extent with good reason. Barack Obama didn't deserve the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009. He had only been in office for a few months when the Nobel Committee made the decision. It was ridiculous. It was a joke for the Nobel Peace Prize itself. But in Trump's mind, he should have it. If Barack Obama got it, why shouldn't Trump have it? And he convinced Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm sure Abe laughed as he signed the nomination because he knew it wasn't going to happen. But maybe Starmer should say, I will nominate you when I get back to London for the Nobel Peace Prize. In fact, now that I think about it, that may do the trick.
That's excellent advice from you. Peace deal negotiations will kick off again today in Turkey between the US and Russia. Do you have any inclination of how long you think that we'll be going before we get the end of this war?
Well, I don't think there's any sign from Zelensky that he's about to make concessions. I think much of what's happened in the past couple of weeks since Trump's inauguration has actually strengthened Zelensky's position in Ukraine. I think the people are more determined to resist. And let's not forget about Moscow. Trump has already given them big chunks of the positions they wanted, giving up on restoring Ukraine to full sovereignty and territorial integrity, removing the possibility of NATO membership, essentially removing the possibility of U.S. participation in security guarantees. So in the Kremlin, they're sitting around thinking, good grief, we didn't ask for enough, let's ask for more. So their position is actually toughening because they think that Trump will, in order to make the deal, will go out of his way to provide additional concessions. So I don't think the path of these negotiations will be even, and I don't think it will be quick.
And Trump, Steve Witkoff kind of failed to say if Russia would be making any concessions, but then Donald Trump in his cabinet meeting said that they would, but we obviously don't know the ins and the outs. But moving on, John, you told CNN the other day that you thought Donald Trump's brain was full of mush. He wasn't making much sense anymore. Look, this wasn't taken seriously when there were concerns about Joe Biden's cognitive abilities throughout his term. So my question is, do you think it's time for Donald Trump to take a cognitive exam the way he did in 2018?
Well, it was a really tough exam. Could he tell what an elephant was and things like that? Look, part of this is he experiencing cognitive decline, or was he always at the level he's at now? And I would tend toward the latter view. I didn't think he was fit to be president when he was in. I don't think he's fit to be president now. He doesn't have the basic knowledge that presidents have to have. He has no interest in learning, and he doesn't read any briefing papers or anything like that. So, whether he's declined or not, he's not up to the job. And but that doesn't bother his supporters, unfortunately. And I think it's one of the reasons why he's such an easy mark for people like Vladimir Putin, who know how to manipulate him, and he doesn't even realize he's being manipulated. He said of Kim Jong-un of North Korea, we fell in love. Well, I can guarantee you that's not what Kim Jong-un thinks, but it's a way for them to get what they want out of Trump while he's trying to make sure that he doesn't disrupt the friendship that he thinks he has with them.
In the last 4 weeks since he's been president, John, and saying that his brain is kind of full of mush right now, whether or not he should take a cognitive exam, is there anything specific moments that you've been watching on thinking you're not all there?
Well, I think he's not there in the sense he doesn't appreciate what it means to act at the international level. His fascination with authoritarian figures, I think, is because he sees them as big guys, decisive. They're strong people, and he wants to be like them. And I would say there's something wrong with somebody who's president of the United States who thinks they have to compare themselves to anybody else. But Trump is constantly doing that.
You recently spoke at Yale University, John, where you spoke about how America shouldn't be afraid of a regime change, which is, of course, of kind of taking out one administration or party and bringing in another one through military force. Do you think that is what should happen right now in the U.S.?
No. What I was talking about American foreign policy, looking at the controversy we've seen over the past 20 years about regime change, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and the like, and it was a debate at the Yale Political Union, like the Oxford and Cambridge unions, and I was trying to explain, however controversial it's been, it's nothing new in human history. It's a tool in our national security toolbox, just like it is for everybody else, and it's the opposite side of the coin of regime preservation when you try and keep your friends secure.
So, Bill Browder, it's hard to even know where to start, but thank you for joining the Trump Report today. It has been an insane few days since Friday, since that pretty frustrating meeting between Zelensky and Trump. We'll get into that a little bit later in the interview. So I want to start a little bit more, I guess, timely, as we like to do, with the European summit that was held over the weekend. Keir Starmer has really stepped up to the plate. Him and Macron met with other European leaders to discuss basically how they're going to start pulling their weight. What was your kind of outcome from the summit that took place?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I think Sir Keir Starmer really showed amazing and immense leadership. This is a moment in history where the free world needs leadership. And he stepped into that role, and he did so in an absolutely impressive and statesman-like way. And for him to organize an emergency meeting of all the, as he describes, the allies of the willing, is really something very special. The second thing that's really important to say is that if you remember, everybody was wringing their hands a few weeks ago talking about how Trump and Putin were sort of excluding Europe and Ukraine from the conversation. And now we have just the opposite happening, where Europe and Ukraine are excluding Trump from the conversation. Not willingly, he sort of excluded himself, but we're in a situation where, Europe, which is an enormous economic and physical body with a lot of people and a lot of resources, is now, through its collective action, stepping up and showing that Europe has got a very important place in how this war ends up resolving itself.
And the thing that we've always known, especially you, Bill, who's so deep in the situation, is that Europe has always had a role in this war. It was just kind of sitting still for a bit, and obviously we didn't know how the United States was going to play this. We didn't know if they were going to be the ones to broker this deal, but look, the narrative shifts every single week. We know that. But the one thing that we have known is that Donald Trump has wanted Europe to step up and kind of take more ownership over their own area. So I wonder, is your interpretation basically similar to what some people believe, that you say what you want about Donald Trump, he has been successful in getting Europe to step up, invest more in their defense, commit to helping Ukraine in any capacity that it needs, even after a peace deal is brokered. Is that your interpretation, that at least he actually got that done?
No, not at all. I don't think that he had a strategy starting from the very beginning. It's clear, that you can't hide what's really happening here anymore. Donald Trump, from the very beginning, has had a horrible personal animosity towards Vladimir Zelensky. If we have to just go back in time and remember that it was when Donald Trump's first term where they had a phone call in which Donald Trump said, I'm going to withhold military aid for you, Ukraine. This was before the full-scale invasion, but when Ukraine was still fighting with Russia in a situation which we all tried to ignore in the West, where we called it Russian-backed separatists. But there was a war going on. Ukraine needed weapons. Donald Trump was withholding those weapons in exchange for manufactured information on Hunter Biden. And Zelensky very adeptly sidestepped that issue, didn't get involved, and that was the basis for Donald Trump's first impeachment. And so he's hated Zelensky from that moment on. And you could see the hatred. The hatred comes out in almost every possible moment. And so what's been happening here is not a grand plan. This is Donald Trump doesn't like Zelensky. He apparently does like Putin. He talked about that in this meeting, how both of them have been so unfairly treated, and so there is no grand plan here. And if there had been a grand plan, the outcome of this particular situation is not what Donald Trump would have liked. I mean, all of the weapons that have been purchased before were purchased from American manufacturers. Now the European manufacturers are all ramping up in a big way. There's going to be a huge boom for European defense industry. I don't think that if Donald Trump was intending, I don't think that was his intended outcome to this whole story. And of course, we're just in the middle of a major fluid situation, but it doesn't look like he's getting what he wants out of this. It looks like he's not getting anything of what he wants out of this.
Do you think that you could say that this is payback from Trump to Zelensky for not investigating the situation with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden a little more? And for anyone watching who's a bit confused as to what that situation is, there was allegations that Hunter Biden had gotten his VP daddy to help fire a prosecutor, I think it was Victor Shokin, years ago. And Donald Trump wanted Zelensky to basically, investigate it a little bit further. So is Donald Trump now using his presidency as payback? He's got the power. He knows he knows that he's the guy that can get this deal done, but kind of wants to hang it over Zelensky's head.
Well, that's one theory, and I mean that's an element. I would say I think there's so much going on here. It's clear for whatever reason, Trump has wanted to side with Putin, and he in many conversations and speeches in the past, long before this ever happened, he was saying that Putin's not such a bad guy. He admires him. That's the way to do things. In the 2018 Helsinki summit, he sided with Putin over the U.S. intelligence services about Russian interference in the U.S. election. And most dramatically, what we saw is at the United Nations, when there was a vote on the third anniversary of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine on chastising and criticizing Russia and calling Russia the invader, you had Donald Trump instruct his UN ambassador to vote against that resolution alongside Russia, North Korea, Iran, and various other bad countries. Even China, in that particular case, abstained. But Donald Trump, and his government, sided with the dictators over the democracies.
But is there reason to believe, Bill, that there's a master plan here from Trump that if he shows some sort of alliance with Russia, shows that he's willing to treat them as an equal, if you will, that they will be able to broker a peace deal?
Well, that's by far the most generous way to interpret all this stuff, but I don't think that's the case. Because it's very simple. So far, if you look at everything that's happened, Donald Trump has been jumping up and down, demanding, threatening, hectoring Zelensky in every possible way, and has not said a single thing to Putin. Now, if he's trying to get Putin to do something, he should be jumping up and down and hectoring and threatening Russia as well. He's not said a single thing. There has not been a single moment where Donald Trump or any of his people have demanded anything of Russia. And so if they were hoping for peace, then why would they be not criticizing Putin for increasing the bombing of cities and civilians in Ukraine while this supposed peace negotiation was going on? It just doesn't fall into any of those. Everybody is trying to thread the needle through some tiny little hole to all make it like there's some strategy here that Donald Trump is actually doing what's right. But there's not a single element of reality that supports that. What we see is what's happening, which is that he's siding with Putin, siding with the aggressor over the victim in every possible way. And there's no generous way to sort of unpack that to make it look like there's some grand strategy here.
But that is the thing, Bill, is that throughout the last few days there has been a certain rhetoric of people trying to understand Trump's point of view. And to be honest, from a personal point, I actually came at a loss here. I couldn't understand certain strategies from the Trump administration. And it's an excellent point that you raise, is that a lot of the conversation is surrounding the diplomatic discussions between all the different countries, if you could call it diplomacy, between Russia. But the reality is Russia is still orchestrating numerous drone attacks on Kyiv overnight. Some of the biggest drone attacks they did last week. I think it was last Sunday. So the war is still very much going on despite negotiations taking place or discussions taking place. But I want to get your thoughts on the fact that Russia, after the European summit, slammed it, saying it was anti-Trump and anti-Russia. And those taking part in this European summit are the ones that actually want to continue the war. What was your reaction to when that kind of statement came out?
Well, I mean, you can't listen to a word that Russia says or Putin says or Lavrov says because it's all just complete nonsense. But I mean, as you said, let's just look at the facts. At any point in time, Russia could stop the war. They invaded. They're the ones attacking. They're the ones who could retreat. They're the ones who can stop bombing. They're the ones who can stop sending troops across Ukrainian territory. They could stop. He's not stopped anything. And so you've got a country that's defending itself, Ukraine, and you've got a country that's attacking, Russia. And then you have people who are allies of the victim, Europe, and and the United States used to do that. And our job as allies of the victim was to try to do whatever we could up to putting our own soldiers in harm's way to try to help the Ukrainians from this unfair, unjustified war of aggression. And that's what we've been doing. And the United States has pulled out. And Europe, who have more at stake than the United States because we don't have an ocean separating us from Russia, they're on our continent, is doing everything it can to continue to try to help the victim defend itself against the aggressor. That's as simple as that.
When you hear people say that it's not a black and white situation between Russia-Ukraine war, what's your response to that?
Well, I don't know what's not black and white about it. There were battalions of Russian tanks that rolled across the border of a sovereign country that wasn't theirs in an act of aggression, killing many people along the way, many innocent people, killing many soldiers. They weren't invited. They weren't provoked, and they did so on the basis of a complete sort of propaganda frenzy that Putin had put together for one very simple reason, which is that wars help dictators stay in power, and Putin is a dictator. He'd been around for a very long time, and he's desperately afraid of losing power because if he loses power, he ends up getting arrested, having all his money confiscated, and dying. And so it's a very simple, totally predictable, happened before, it will happen again in the world, action of a dictator, and unfortunately is happening on our continent. And if we don't do something about it, he'll continue rolling into other countries.
It is exactly right. It's about preventing a wider war. And I thought it was an interesting point from Nikki Haley the other day. She said, basically, when a dictator tells you they're going to do something, believe them. They're always telling you they're going to do something. Putin said he was going to invade Ukraine, and he has. He says he will invade Poland next, and maybe Belarus. We don't know. This will happen. It's a domino effect. But when it comes to the relationship between the United States and Europe right now, Bill, we know that it's been divisive. But in the last few days, so much has been happening. We've seen the United States kind of pull back from their support from Ukraine, and we've seen the UK and France and various other European countries offer more support, even at a time when you've had Macron and Keir Starmer go to Washington and kind of really play the game with Trump. They did various things in their meetings with Trump that just showed, especially Keir Starmer, that he knew how to play this. So as of right now, how do you think the relationship is between the US and Europe?
I think it's completely frazzled. I mean, I wouldn't say totally destroyed yet because I think there's some chance. You know, we didn't have Donald Trump and J.D. Vance shouting at Keir Starmer, thank God. But I think that at this stage of the game, you know, the U.S. has clearly indicated that it has no appetite to support Ukraine anymore. There have been a number of other speeches, particularly J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he basically insulted Europe and kind of left, you know, didn't say anything bad about Russia and Putin, but everything bad about UK and Germany, Romania and other places. You've had the Trump administration pressure the Romanian authorities to release Andrew Tate, an indicted sex criminal who is then allowed to fly to the United States and I guess to sort of celebrations in Palm Beach. I mean, it's, again, the heads of state are going to try to play it all nice and say all diplomatic things because, the cost of having the United States split from the transatlantic alliance is really dramatically high. But it's pretty obvious what's happening right now, and there's only one saving grace in this whole situation, which is that Trump is such a volatile character that he could, as easily as he's completely changed his attitude towards Ukraine and Russia, he could and Europe, he could change again. Anything could happen. He gets mad about something, generally a personal grievance, and then acts out on that. And so that's our only hope, is that somehow his total crazy character will turn around and somehow embrace. I mean, look at, for example, Marco Rubio when he completely. You should hear the speeches of Marco Rubio during campaign attacking Trump and him calling him Little Marco and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, Marco Rubio is his Secretary of State. So anything is possible in this Trump world in terms of geopolitics, because he could change on a dime on reasons that we might not ever even understand.
And it is important to note that we're only 5 weeks into this Trump administration. There has been so much. I think anyone following US politics has whiplash from Donald Trump changing his mind and the administration doing various things that we don't agree with, or some might. But I think we should get into what happened on Friday, Bill. This was a very unprecedented moment, having Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky basically having a bit of a screaming match. Members of Trump's cabinet sitting there, occasionally piping up to speak. But Mike Waltz later on over the weekend, he said that the US, he thinks that Ukraine basically needs a leader that can deal with the US, can deal with Russia to end the war, and that actually wants peace. So the narrative that the United States is now pushing is Zelensky is the problem. Is that what are your thoughts on that Zelensky is the problem right now?
Well, that's what Putin thinks. So, I mean, again, let's just look at what's happened here. So the basic approach of this whole, so Trump wants to end the war in one day. That's his big campaign promise. How does he end the war in one day? Well, Putin's not changing anything. Putin wants he had a maximalist approach and has never compromised for a second. And so the only way that you can make anyone to change the situation is to have the other side, the weaker side, Ukraine, capitulate and give in to Vladimir Putin's demands. And then you've got Zelensky, who is the same leader who, when he was offered a helicopter out of Kiev on the day that Russia invaded, said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." This is the war hero, the Churchillian war hero, who has stood up to Russia for 3 years and caused Putin an unbelievable nightmare that he could have never imagined. And this guy is saying, no, I'm not going to capitulate. I'm not going to capitulate on behalf of my country. And since he's not capitulating and Putin is not going to give up, then they're saying, okay, let's attack him in the Oval Office. Let's humiliate him. Let's humiliate him in front of the whole world, and then criticize him for not capitulating, and then asking for his resignation. How does that serve anyone's interests other than Vladimir Putin's? And so Zelensky is not the problem. If anyone should resign, it's J.D. Vance should resign for attacking a head of state. That was the most unprofessional thing I've ever seen in my entire life. J.D. Vance should resign, not Vladimir Zelensky.
Well, Bill, you were in the room at the Munich Security Conference when you saw J.D. Vance do that speech, which was very pro-Russia and not pro any allies. Now, do you think in that moment when J.D. Vance was shouting at Zelensky, which quite literally did look like a scene out of a TV show, I couldn't believe it when I was watching that live, do you think J.D. Vance in that moment lost international respect? But also, he's been labelled, Trump's minion that made a fool out of the United States.
Well, what he did was he I mean, so and there's not a person that can watch that situation and not feel outrage at the way that they treated Vladimir Zelensky, and not feel total sympathy for Vladimir Zelensky. And you saw that. I mean, his next meeting was with the King of England. His next meeting was with, and every head of state from every other place said, "We're behind you, Vladimir." This is a David and Goliath fight between David being the Ukrainians and Zelensky, and Goliath being Putin. And everybody sides with David. Everybody sides with injustice, and they're the victim of injustice, not the perpetrator of injustice. The American people sided with Zelensky, and so it's completely what happened defies any, breaks every norm in every possible situation. And of course, Donald Trump likes to break norms. He likes to be the disruptor, but this is not an appropriate and a reasonable disruption.
So many people think that the way Donald Trump interacts with Vladimir Putin is a strategy, that he knows how to deal with someone with such a dictatorial nature. And perhaps he sees himself in him, we don't know. But do you think that's true? Or are you more of the understanding that Donald Trump is actually pro-Russia winning this war?
I think, okay, that's actually a really great question. I'm not actually of the school that says that Putin has some kind of like compromising material. I think just Donald Trump doesn't really believe in democracy and checks and balances and limits on executive authority and stuff like that. If you listen to him on Twitter and on TV and his social media service, he constantly talks about, how the president has unlimited authority and the president can do whatever he wants, and how Al Capone was great. He just said on Twitter the other day, the great Al Capone, right? I mean, he has this kind of gangsterish mentality about the office, and I think that's what's provoked so much anxiety. You see that in the way that Elon Musk is sort of cutting away through the government without going through Congress. Trump is governing through executive order. I mean, it's, there's a big debate, is Trump a fascist? I don't want to go there, but I mean, he has a kind of authoritarian style, which I think is what brings him to be more comfortable around authoritarians. Kamala Harris said this in the election last year, and I think she was correct, that he likes autocrats because he wants to be one. And I think, I genuinely think that Donald Trump is a threat to U.S. democracy. I share that opinion. And I think that's one of the reasons why he likes Putin. I think he admires the way Putin governs Russia and would like to govern like that inside the United States, where, of course, he faces much greater institutional checks. So I think that's really all it is. I don't actually think there's some kind of conspiracy out there and the rest of it. But the real problem, of course, is that because he likes Putin so much, right, it looks an awful lot like he's going to sort of throw the Ukrainians under the bus. And I think that's the real problem. If you're the Europeans, that's simply not an acceptable outcome, because that feeds Russian aggression, and then they're going to come back in a couple of years. And I think this is where there's going to be a European-U.S. breach, because the Europeans are not, and the Ukrainians are not going to agree to a deal that just sort of throws Ukraine to the Russians. I mean, that would be terrible for European security, and they're going to fight. And I don't know if Trump cares enough to resolve that without just allowing NATO to fracture.
Yeah, especially because I think a lot of European leaders are of the impression that it doesn't stop at Ukraine. It will seep into Poland and keep furthering on. It's one of those things, when a dictator tells you what they're going to do, believe them. This is what he said he's going to do. But Bob, Donald Trump, everything when it comes to Donald Trump comes down to money, comes down to feeding the US economy, comes down to strengthening America first. We've even seen this with Elon Musk when it comes to I guess, cutting funding. And then Elon Musk has come out and spoken about how the US could go broke if this happens. But then this rhetoric has been turning away Europe, Canada, NATO countries, because it seems as if right now he's choosing Russia, which is an economy that doesn't even reach the size of Texas. So what is the point of alienating Europe when it comes to their economy and choosing Russia's dwindling economy over former big allies with large economies? Does that make sense?
No, and I don't think anybody really in the analyst community actually believes that either. Again, sort of in the area that I operate in, right? Again, sort of the conferences and all that. I mean, I don't know anybody who really thinks that this is a good idea. And certainly, I think the response inside from sort of U.S. defense intellectuals, and in my area specifically international relations as an academic discipline, I think there's actually a lot of concern about why Trump is doing this, to exactly to the point that you just make, right? I mean, Russia's GDP, Russia's gross domestic product is about $2 trillion a year, which is, I think, something like 1/10 or 1/15 of what the European Union European Union's GDP is, right? Russia's economy is smaller than Germany, France, Britain, I believe even smaller than Italy. It's about the same size as Spain, if I get the numbers correct. And you can just sort of check those numbers. The point is that, as you said, Russia, and also Russia's pretty technologically backward because it's been sanctioned, of course, and sort of cut off from modern technologies. We see that in the Ukraine war where the Russians are using Soviet-era technology. And so Russia is a really odd partner, right, for the United States. And again, I think this is the most obvious explanation for that is Trump's personal affinity, his personal affection for Vladimir Putin. There is one possible strategic argument that the Trump administration has been throwing around that might work, that might explain some of this. And the idea here is that we're going to sort of like give up on Ukraine or kind of like give them a bad deal in order to pull Russia away from China, in order to use Russia against China to help isolate China because China is the greater threat to the United States over the coming decades. I agree geopolitically that China is a much greater threat to the United States in the next 40 years or so. The possibility of a second Cold War, I think, is real, and it would be nice if the Russians would help us. But it doesn't look like Putin actually wants to do that. I mean, there's not much evidence to suggest that Putin actually wants that breach. The Chinese have helped him a great deal in the conflict. So maybe that's the master plan. But honestly, I'm not sure that Donald Trump is playing like 8-dimensional chess. I think he's just kind of winging it, to be honest.
And most analysts, and I feel like you might agree with this, Bob, is that when I ask about how China is viewing the United States' interaction with Russia, they all say that China's looking at the US thinking they look weak. And it's furthering that desire to start to plan to invade Taiwan because the United States is pushing away their biggest allies, especially when it comes to in the Pacific region and in that South China Sea. So it will be interesting to watch that. But we're going to get into more, I guess, domestic relations now to wrap up the interview. We've seen Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, going to France, going to the UK to meet King Charles and Keir Starmer for his first international trip and breaking that protocol, Bob, of which is he's meant to visit the United States first. Amid this tension with Trump, he's continuing to say that that Canada should join the US, become the 51st state. So how tense do you think this relationship right now is between these two long-standing allies, especially amid tariffs and back and forth public spats?
Yeah, I think it's a real shock. I mean, it's not even clear where this came from, right? I mean, Donald Trump's voters weren't told this last year. I mean, if you watched the American election campaign last year, there was nothing at all about how the United States was going to engage in local continental expansionism. You know, Greenland, Canada, Trump's talked about bombing Mexico, seems to be interested in retaking the Panama Canal. I mean, all of these ventures, if we actually did this, all these countries would resist. This would require the use of American military force, which would provoke all kinds of problems. I mean, Canada would become a quagmire. It'd be like Iraq on America's northern border. I'm not sure if the Trump people have remotely thought that through. The same thing in Panama. If we went back to Panama, it would turn into a guerrilla war. It'd be Vietnam all over again. We'd be there for 20 years fighting rebels in the jungle. You know, I mean, I just don't know. Again, this is what I mean when I think that Donald Trump isn't really playing 8-dimensional chess. I just don't think the president is really thinking this through. I think these things kind of come into his head and he just kind of shoots them out on the internet, on Truth Social or whatever. He doesn't really have a lot of good impulse control. I think we can all agree about that with Donald Trump. And he just says this stuff, right? And he gets sort of hung up on things. I would be shocked if the United States were to actually try to use force to annex Canada. But to your point, I mean, he does keep bringing it up, right? I mean, it was, I guess, kind of funny, you know, a month ago. And I mean, I think Americans maybe are a little bit to blame about this, right? Because the Americans often kind of treat Canada like it's a joke and it's not really its own country, you know, South Park movie and all that. But I mean, we shouldn't actually, right? I mean, Canada's actually been a really good partner of the United States for a really, really long time, right? They were at Normandy. They helped us a lot after 9/11. I mean, Canada's been an excellent neighbor for the United States for a century. And it's really kind of shocking. And I just don't, again, I don't know what the Trump endgame here is, right? Alienating Canada, right? I mean, what purpose does that, how does that suit American national security? Unless we're actually going to absorb Canada and invade it, there's no point to constantly provoking them. And of course, if we invaded Canada, that would just be, I mean, that would break NATO overnight. The United States would be completely isolated. So I'm actually pretty surprised. I imagine that most of the people around the president know that this is an error. I would imagine that NSA Waltz and Secretary of State Rubio both would like the president to stop talking about this. But you know, the Republican Party is kind of cultish now. Trump is like the great leader, you know, and he says stuff, and people just aren't willing to contradict him the way they were, when he first emerged like 10 years ago.
Well, just a final question for you, Bob. The justification for this is just been so bizarre because most polls, as you mentioned, have about 90% of Canadians opposing this, but then you see members of his administration backing it. We saw Marco Rubio backing this, but this is a sovereign country that borders the United States. Is this not sounding a little bit like Groundhog Day? Is this not sounding a little bit like rhetoric familiar to what Vladimir Putin has just done?
Yeah, and that's actually one of the concerns that I think Canadians have been sort of tossing around. I was at a conference, a sort of NATO event for East Asia a couple of weeks ago, and there are Canadians there who were saying, is this like the American version of the Ukraine conflict, where this sort of weak neighbor and the Americans want to absorb us like Putin has done in Ukraine? And yeah, as you said, I mean, it's just, unless the United States is actually going to militarily absorb Canada, which would be a huge venture. There are 40 million people and they would fight. It would lead to an insurgency. Even if we won the war, there'd almost certainly be an insurgency. We'd be fighting in the cities and in the hills against resistance for a decade, right? So even if we, that's really the only route to get unification between Canada and the United States. I mean, the Canadians have made it really, really clear they don't want this. And again, it's just not clear why this is being said other than Trump's own personal paranoias and conspiracy theories. And that's the way I read this, that I think a lot of this behavior on tariffs, the commentary on the Ukraine war, the commentary on Canada, a lot of this is Trump, and he's just unbound and he doesn't have a good sense of discipline. He's not really a politician. He doesn't, he kind of like won the presidency by a fluke. And I just think he doesn't quite know how to actually be the president, right? He's kind of in there because he didn't want to go to jail, stuff like that. I mean, he's not actually really committed to the office and the institutions of U.S. government. And so he just doesn't feel like it's a problem to go on TV and say outlandish stuff like this. I mean, he's a real outlier in American presidential history.
You think he's making it up on the spot, Bob?
Yeah, I do. I actually think the president is winging it. I mean, if you look at, I wrote a lot about the president's interaction with Kim Jong-un in 2000, the leader of North Korea, in 2017, 18, 19. And it was pretty clear if you read the transcripts and you actually sort of like follow what was discussed in the meetings that Trump was just pulling it out of the air. He sort of flew into Singapore in the summer of 2018 for the big thing. That was when everybody covered it. I went to Singapore as part of the BBC. It was this big coverage. It was going to be this big breakthrough. And Trump just walked in the room with no prep. And we know now from the people around him who wrote their books that Trump didn't prepare for it at all. He didn't know anything about ballistic missiles. He didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. Didn't know anything about the conventional balance in Korea. He just kind of walked in there and he just winged it. And that's my sense of this, is that Trump is just kind of thrown it together as he goes. It's not a conspiracy. It's incompetence.
Today, I'm joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, and also founder and editor of EA Worldview. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thank you so much for letting me join in on the fun.
So today we've seen that the trade war between China and the US has ramped up again as China's announced that it will be raising additional tariffs on US goods to 125%, which is up from 84%. I mean, Beijing wasn't playing around when they said that they would fight to the end.
Yeah, they're serious about it. I mean, it's now a case of pick a number, any number, in terms of the specific tariffs. What happened overnight is that the United States, the Trump administration went up from 125% already to 145% on China. They said the extra 20% is because of fentanyl-related Chinese products going into the United States, using that rationale. And the Chinese, who were already, I think, at 84%, like you mentioned, like, okay, fine, you're not going to push this around, we'll go to 125. What the Chinese actually said was quite interesting. They said, look, we're not going to respond to any more increases from the United States because the numbers are kind of meaningless now. Because, the Chinese goods going into the United States are going to be so expensive as it is. That's kind of the done deal. So what you have is Beijing effectively saying, all right, what you've got is now a total break in trade between China and the U.S. They're telling their companies, there's no need for you to be thinking about exporting to the U.S. now. They are now talking about how can they find alternative markets for their exports, which raises some very interesting questions about relations within Asia, including with India. They are now talking about subsidies for their companies to find domestic customers rather than having to export their goods that take place. They're intervening on their currency markets where they may be able to devalue the yuan, what we call the RMB as well, to make it, as it were, cheaper for exports to be sold abroad to other countries apart from the United States. In other words, China has always had this advantage if it came to a trade war with the U.S. in that it has a centrally planned economy. It has a centrally organized economy. Now they're going to use all the levers at their disposal, both to prop up their manufacturers and producers within the country, and then to find someone other than the United States to take their products.
It's an interesting point because Macron has said that it's terribly dangerous to think China could one day replace the US. I mean, Trump must be aware of the security threats that may potentially pose.
Well, here, let's start off with the reality about where we are in terms of the global economic system. That we are now at a point where the Trump administration is leaving the U.S.-led economic system established after World War II. I mean, they simply are walking away from it. And probably need to explain that for viewers, because that's quite a dramatic statement to make. But the fact of the matter here is that the Trump administration is no longer recognizing the multilateral organizations and the multilateral processes, not just for trade, but for economic affairs. They already had begun to distance themselves from some of what the International Monetary Fund does, what the World Bank does. They, of course, have shut down U.S. agencies involved in economic programs abroad, whether those be humanitarian programs, whether that be economic development programs. Now what they effectively are saying is, look, we're not going to be part of the World Trade Organization. We're not pursuing this through the WTO, which was, again, the organization that the U.S. led in establishing through, for example, the Kennedy Round on tariffs in the 1960s, and then the revised General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade under the Clinton administration in '94. What the Trump administration is doing is they are pursuing an approach which says we go with bilateral approaches to each country, and we try to get the best arrangements for ourselves with each country. In other words, we try to get money from them, or we try to get advantages for our products rather than their products, advantages for our manufacturing rather than theirs. So rather than treating trade as a win-win within the system established after World War II, they're establishing it as a win-lose relationship. Now, if the U.S. is going to act outside of the global economic system, which it formerly led, what happens then? China, for years, this is no secret, has been trying to establish an alternative economic system. China, of course, one of the largest countries in the world, so therefore it's one of the largest producers in the world. It has one of the largest manufacturing sectors in the world, one of the largest agricultural sectors, has vast leaps in technology. We know all of that. But the Chinese currency, again, internationally known as the RMB, is not convertible. You can't take money out of China in RMB and get pounds or euros or dollars for it. That's where the U.S. has always had an advantage, that the world's reserve currency, the currency that backs up the euro, the currency that backs up the pound, the currency that backs up the international system is the dollar. It's been that way for decades. And now that may no longer be the case. And indeed, the Trump administration has even discussed withdrawing the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So what do you do then? Who do you trade with? Who do you interact with? China has to be part of that possibility. And to bring it around to what Emmanuel Macron was saying is, in recent years, there had been this sort of competitive approach where the United States had been saying, don't trade with China. Don't deal with China. They're a security threat. Not just Trump said that, Biden folks said it. Now, given that Trump is the threat, Europeans have to make a choice. Do you continue to refrain from trading with China, establishing investment deals with China, or do you go back now and establish deals with them because they're going to be wanting them with you? China's going to be approaching the EU, and can you afford to keep them at arm's length? And that will not just be a question for the Europeans. It will be a question for India, for example, one of the world's largest economies, which has felt threatened by China in the past, but which is now saying, well, if the U.S. is going to act this way, we may need to look at economic cooperation with Beijing in a way that we weren't even considering a few weeks ago.
And do you think that implies that Trump in some ways is depending on countries like the UK and the EU to not fall back on China, for example?
Now, the main reason why Trump U-turned and it was a significant retreat earlier this week, where he said, oh, okay, all these big tariffs, like 20% on the EU and 45% on other countries, 26% on Japan. Why he retreated on 10%, the major reason which we can talk about was the crisis in the US bond market. But one factor here is that the US or the Trump administration has decided, okay, we're going all in on China. We're going to fight China in. They need support from other countries. They need support from the EU. They need support from India. They need support from Latin American countries or from other Asian countries, even as they're punishing those countries with the 10% tariff that remains or with the tariffs on steel and aluminum. So yeah, there is a factor here which is backing off of the highest tariffs on some of these countries to try to get them on your side versus China. The problem here is, as long as the Trump administration still has those tariffs in place that it has imposed. And let's, by the way, give a figure here to explain this to you. The highest tariff rate on the United States, I believe, in average weighted tariff is India, around 10 to 12%. The effective US tariff rate now, globally, is 27%. Even if you take China out of the equation, the effective US tariff rate on everyone else is 11%. The US has now become one of the leading tariff punishers in the world at the same time that it's saying to the other countries, oh, well, you know, we may be hurting your car industry, your steel, your aluminum, but you still should work with us against Beijing.
And we can see that the Trump administration, they're trying to play this off as being some sort of brilliant master plan from Trump, and that this pause on the high rates of tariffs, that was all part of this plan. That was all part of his strategy all along. I mean, I think it's interesting because if I think back to a few weeks ago when we had that Signal group chat leak, it was dominating headlines. And now, since so much has happened, it feels as though it's almost water under the bridge. You know, no one took the hit for what happened there. It feels like a distant memory. So I kind of wonder, how damaging is this pause on tariffs actually going to be for Trump's legacy?
You know what Trump's legacy is? And I'm going to say it, because let's get to the YouTube comments. Let's just say exactly what here is. At this point, Trump's legacy is a wannabe bully trying to rip apart the international system and the US system to get personal profit in terms of power and, yes, money. His legacy is as a wannabe bully who is being undone by the fact that he is an economic moron. And I'm going to say it again. The world's supposedly successful businessman, who, by the way, had 6 bankruptcies, does not understand the basics of economics. So let's go to your question then, that he was some type of genius in having to retreat on tariffs. I was in studio working with Irish Television on Wednesday night when this came about. And I sat there and I knew this line was being spun by the White House. What an incredibly great move. Isn't he wonderful? And there was a Trump representative who was on the TV show that night, the former U.S. ambassador to Greenland, Denmark, who still wants the U.S. to seize Greenland, by the way. That's another story. And she was trotting out all these lines, how skillfully he had done this. And Trump himself told the media a day later, he told them on Thursday, he said, I'm a weaver. I'm a weaver of stories. I can weave so well. I'm a genius. Okay. Time to cut through the spin. And that's a polite word for what it is. Here's what happened. And you will make of it whether or not Trump had planned this all along. And it gets us, and if you forgive me, we need a few minutes here, because it's a story that brings out not just Trump, it brings out what's happening within the Trump administration. April 2nd is Liberation Day, and Trump brings out the magic chart. The magic chart with all those numbers that he has the Commerce Secretary bring up. Howard, bring up the chart, bring up the chart. And it's like China has 64% tariffs, and, or 68%, so we're going to put a 34% tariff on them. And so on. And the European Union, 39% tariff, so we'll hit them with 20%. Japan, 46% tariff, we'll hit them with 23%. Poor Lesotho in Africa apparently has 100% tariff on U.S. products. We'll hit them with 50%. Okay, yeah. What did Lesotho do to you? The Herd and McDonald Islands which is uninhabited, except for penguins, we're going to give them a 10% tariff because I guess the penguins are making some type of product that's flooding the US market. You know, that chart was nonsense. Here, and I need to explain what I mean by, if you don't want to call them an economic moron, economically illiterate. All you had to do was look up the effective average weighted tariff, and you would find out what time. Now, let's leave China as a special case, because China is not whiter than white when it comes to trade. The European Union's average weighted tariff on US products in 2024 was 1%. 1. Not 39, 1. The Japanese average weighted tariff in 2024 on US products was not 46%, it was between 3 and 4%. Australia got hit with a 10% tariff, even though they have an effective free trade agreement with the United States and they have a 0% tariff on this. What happened, what we know now is the Trump administration did not base the magic chart on what tariffs are on other countries. They took the trade balance in goods. If the U.S. had a trade deficit in goods, they divided it by the amount of imports that the U.S. took from a particular country. So let's say, for example, that Britain had given $100 billion of exports to the United States, but let's say the United States had a $25 billion deficit in goods, they would have said, oh, that's a 25% tariff on US products. That is nonsense. A tariff is not a trade balance. What a trade balance, or imbalance as you will, is when you buy more goods than you sell. And American consumers like to buy stuff. That's what it comes down to. So none of that chart had anything to do with tariffs. What it had to do with it was a U.S. goods deficit. But here is why it continues to be nonsense. A trade balance is not just made up of goods. It's also made up of services. The U.S., to a lot of countries, has a huge trade services surplus. Technology, support for other companies, right? The U.S., for example, has a deficit with Ireland in terms of goods, which is around about $100 billion. 100 billion euros, I should say. But it has a massive surplus in services to Ireland, where the U.S. has an overall trade surplus with Ireland of 93 billion euros. So using Trump's logic, Ireland should be putting tariffs on the United States. But of course, they just took a number from the European Union, they slap it all in. So what I'm telling you is, from the very start, this project had nothing to do with tariffs. It has nothing to do with reciprocal tariffs. It was an attempt by the Trump people to get money, not from other countries, but to get money from American consumers and manufacturers and from farmers who would have to pay the tariffs. See, that was the strange thing. They weren't even getting money from China or the EU or whatever. They were taking it off of Americans and presenting it as a great victory against all these other countries.
I mean, it was about 3 hours before Trump announced this pause. He posted on his Truth Social platform and said, this is a great time to buy. And now we've got the Democrats, they're accusing Trump of market manipulation. They're calling for Congress to investigate. Meanwhile, we've got Trump allies denying this charge. I mean, what do you make of that?
At 9:37 a.m. Washington time on Wednesday, Donald Trump goes on social media and says, now is a good time to buy. Now is a great time to buy DJT, okay, in all caps. There's an important backdrop to this. We now know that it appears that Trump made his decision that he would have to pull back on the tariffs, in part because of pressure from Republican senators, some of whom had been on Fox TV the previous night to tell him to back down, in part because of pressure from his own donors, including the billionaire like Bill Ackman, in part because other governments are telling him this is not working. But we know that in part because at 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning, he watched Fox TV, and a guy named Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, who's one of the gurus of Wall Street, said, if you keep pressing on with these tariffs, you're going to get yourselves into a serious recession. At 8 a.m. 9:37 a.m., Now, we can't be certain that he had decided for sure to pull the tariffs back, but he goes, a tweet said in all caps. Now remember, now would be a great time to buy DJT. He usually does not sign his tweets on Truth Social DJT. What is DJT? DJT is the 3-letter label for Donald Trump's media company on the NASDAQ stock exchange, 937. The decision to pull back on the tariffs to 10% is made at just after 1 p.m. from the White House, about 3.5 hours later. During the course of the day, beginning after the Trump tweet and before his announcement, stocks rise in Donald Trump's company. Just before the 1 p.m. announcement, there are a series of stock moves, what are called puts, which are to effectively buy the Trump stock now. Get it now. After the announcement, the stock soars further. On Wednesday, Donald Trump's stock, DJT, went up 21.7%. If you bought that stock at the beginning of the day, you've got a 21.7% profit at the end of the day. Now the Democrats, and here's one thing I'll add to this, the Democrats immediately say, all right, this is market manipulation. They say, look, a lot of Donald Trump's friends made money off of this. Donald Trump is on film on Wednesday after his announcement with people in the White House celebrating the fact this person made $500 million, this person made $900 million, this person made $1 billion today. Okay? I've asked 2 senior specialists in financial firms here in Ireland. I won't name them, I will keep this confident, but I asked them because I actually was working with them on various projects. I said, does this constitute spreading market-sensitive insider information, which is a crime? Does this constitute it? And both those people said 100%. The first one said, yeah, said this is a buy sign. This is a buy sign. He issued a buy sign. So if Donald Trump was not president of the United States, he would probably be investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. But here's the stinger in this. The Securities and Exchange Commission since January has been gutted. A lot of its staff have been fired, or they have been told to stop work or to halt litigation because it's part of ripping apart U.S. agencies. So the SEC, even if Trump was not president, might not be able to investigate it because they're no longer effective.
Obviously, to provide the other side of the argument here, you know, Trump's allies are denying these claims. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this. I mean, what I'm interested in is obviously this is a 90-day pause, but, you know, as we saw Trump when he watched that Fox News interview and he said that guy was a genius. I mean, do we think that he's actually going to go through with it all again after 90 days? I mean, surely he's changed his mind.
When they make the decision to slap the tariffs on everybody with the magic chart, with no clue about what it means economically and so on, the stock market reacts with the fact these guys are morons. That's what the stock market did on Thursday and Friday. It just suddenly tanked. And then we were talking about the most serious drops in the market since the pandemic, right? That on all 3 major U.S. stock exchanges, the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ, they all are approaching what we call a bear market, that they'll be more than 20% off their top value. They just narrowly, I think, avoided it. Now, all 3 of those markets are plummeting on Thursday and Friday. So over the weekend, what you get is you get a division in the Trump camp that comes out in light of this. There's one faction in the Trump camp who are, let's call them the warrior protectionist. They want to rip up the international trading system. And they almost want to go to what is economic isolationism. That the United States can do it on its own, and they can do it by bullying other countries and pressing other countries into giving them the trade agreements that they want. Now, this includes Peter Navarro, who was very prominent in U.S. media, including last weekend. This includes the U.S. Trade Representative, Jameson Greer. It probably includes another influential Trump advisor named Stephen Miller. Now, there's another group in the Trump administration who are much more measured in their approach. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the head of the National Economic Council, Kevin Hassett. And that is, all right, yeah, we want to use tariffs, but we want to use tariffs as leverage to get into trade negotiations in a much more measured way with the various folks. When the stock market goes down over the weekend, those guys, it's like, well, look, you got to pull back on this. On Monday of this week, Kevin Hassett went on to Fox Business, and he actually said there might be a 90-day pause in the tariffs, right? And the stock market went up like 4%, boom, just like that. And then the White House came out and said, oh, no, this was misinterpreted. That's because the warrior protectionist kicked back. It said, no. As Peter Navarro then went onto media and said throughout the rest of Monday, no negotiations, no negotiations. Now, as late as Tuesday night, talking to the Republican National Committee and donors, Donald Trump said, all these countries, they can kiss my backside. He actually used a different word, but you can fill that in yourself. They can kiss my backside. He said that on Tuesday night. And I'm sorry, but I just need to tell you this because it just kicks all this stuff into touch. What happened on Tuesday night going into Wednesday is there was a run on the U.S. bond market. And by a run, what I meant is everybody was trying to dump their U.S. bonds. They were trying to sell them. Japan, twice, I've got this on high authority, Japan twice went onto the bond market overnight. They couldn't find anybody to buy the bonds. Now, this is really unusual. It's really unusual because when the U.S. stock market drops down, people usually go into bonds as the safe haven, right? This didn't happen this time because what was happening is that people said, we don't trust U.S. bonds. We don't trust that they're secure now. Instead, they were going into German bonds. German bonds increased in value, decreased in yield, increased in price significantly. If you cannot sell U.S. bonds, if the U.S. government cannot sell U.S. bonds, they can't finance their debt. And on Wednesday morning, as Jamie Dimon from J.P. Morgan was saying, you're heading into recession, there were Trump advisors that went in and told Trump, this is the situation that you're in. Now, you want to ask me what he's going to do next. What he's done next is mixed. He has retreated on some of the tariffs, not all of them, but some of the tariffs. But at the same time, he can't appear to be weak. So he's played the tough guy approach specifically with China, right? Now I'm speaking to you on a Friday. What has happened since then? First of all, China has not backed down, right? Because China has not backed down, that meant that the rally in the U.S. stock market after his retreat is gone. The U.S. stock market dropped back on Thursday, and it's probably going to be lower today because the prospect is of a U.S.-China trade war. And a protracted U.S.-China trade war, according to international analysts, for example, at the World Bank, would lead to a 7% drop in global GDP if they keep doing this. U.S.-China trade is 3% of all total trade. So it's knock-on effects because it hurts the Chinese economy, it hurts the U.S. economy, so therefore they can't buy from Europe, they can't buy from Africa, etc. 7% drop in global GDP. And that's what Trump is embarking upon. Now, what he set himself up for is he's going to hit another fundamental decision point, which is as U.S. consumers, as U.S. manufacturers, as U.S. farmers, and as the U.S. stock market are taking the hit, does he back down again? Can he afford to back down again? And that means that what you have is not a planned genius approach. You effectively have an approach which has come down to this. Donald Trump and his inner circle, the warrior protectionists, were effectively the bully in the international playground. And they went into that playground and they said, pay us. Give us your lunch money. Canada said no. Mexico said no. China said no. Even the European Union, the weak old European Union, said no. And what does a bully get done when he is punched in the nose? He still has to act tough, but he either has to accept the fact that he didn't win, or he has to try it on again. And they're trying it on again with China. And I can't tell you how this comes out because we're in unprecedented territory.
Justin, thank you very much for joining us on the Trump Report today.
Mate, the Trump Report, that sounds scary.
I promise I'll try not to scare you too much.
Okay, great. I can't promise the same because I'm here to talk about economics.
We will be talking about economics within the sphere of Donald Trump, and we'll get straight into this. Now, we are quite used to this by now, which is the Trump administration making decisions and then, at least in part, maybe rowing back on them or cooling their rhetoric. And despite China facing 145% tariffs from the US, Trump now is saying that these could come down substantially, and his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, even says there could be a trade deal between the nations. Can you try and make this make sense for me?
So I think it was Friday, Bessent said the tariffs are unsustainable. Then Trump teased they're coming down yesterday. Then Bessent denied that the tariffs were coming down in a roundabout way. And then the White House press secretary walked out and said unequivocally the China tariffs are not changing at all. And so I guess you're left with the question, which one of those folks is in charge? Which one of those is carrying the message? Look, I think, let me try and read between the lines. The claim that 145% tariffs between the US and China are unsustainable is just an obvious fact. That's not a policy decision. You don't need to ask a Treasury Secretary that. You could ask me that, or you could ask anyone who's in business. The claim that Trump wants to pretend there's something going on swirling in the air when in fact he's been waiting next to the phone like a teenage girl waiting for Xi to call, and Xi still hasn't called and he can't get Xi's attention no matter what. That's also a fact. And in terms of policy, the White House has not announced anything improving with respect to China.
Can you see them announcing anything anytime soon? I know you made a graph on X which sort of outlines how long it's been since Xi and President Trump spoke.
So they last spoke 3 days before the inauguration. So all of this, I want your attention, focus on us, we're going to have to do a deal, let's get together, has led to nothing. It's quite striking the extent of economic pain inflicted on everyday Americans and indeed on the global economy, all to get someone's attention. But they're asking for attention the wrong way and so not getting that attention. By the way, that's a very good rule for parenting, probably not such a good rule for international trade. So, it's an expensive way forward. This is a shambolic White House. It's breaking all the rules. Sometimes it breaks those rules and gets things done in ways that others can't. I'm not saying I approve. I'm saying that it's getting things done that it would otherwise be very difficult. But on this particular issue, it's done nothing but create chaos.
I know this is something you've spoken about a lot when you talk about chaos. You said that we're sort of almost in a situation at the moment where every time Trump does something that directly goes against his instincts, the markets respond positively to that.
That's quite a literal claim. You can take any stock chart and you'll see that when Trump announced the April 2 tariffs, stocks tanked. When those tariffs became clearer, they tanked again. When he announced the 90-day pause, they spiked, biggest spike in ages. When he talked about firing Fed Chair Jerome Powell, they tanked. When he walked that back, they spiked. When he said he might walk back the tariffs on China, they spiked. Every time Trump does less Trump, markets applaud.
I guess my question then is, what is the end goal here? Is this some grand plan, or is it just mistake after mistake?
I try to stay out of doing Trumpology. I don't know what's inside one man's brain. What I can tell you is about the economic consequences. This is an unusual way of doing economic policy. So far, it's been destructive, and so far, it hasn't worked. The tariffs, if you listen to the administration, so I'm not trying to look inside anyone's brain, the tariffs have been a policy in search of a rationale forever. The first tariffs were to get rid of fentanyl in the United States or to get cooperation on reducing illegal immigration. Then we moved to talking about tariffs that would onshore manufacturing. And we talked about national security. Then we talked about raising tax revenue so that we could offer tax cuts to everyone. And And the actual April 2nd tariffs were set proportionate to the bilateral trade deficit, which is a whole different beast and its own special incoherence. And so we talked, therefore, about bilateral trade deficits as being what they were trying to cure. Then the president backed down, and it all became about isolating China. He's done that by isolating America from the rest of the world. And you can see that the rationale shifts. And then, as part of the back down, it became about making deals. So you can see the rationale shifts day by day. The thing is, those different rationales would lead you to very different tariffs. Right? If you cared about national security, you might put a tariff on steel, but not leather saddles. But we have an equally high tariff on leather saddles. If you cared about onshoring manufacturing, you might put a tariff on aluminum, but not bananas. We can never grow bananas in the United States, but we have tariffs on bananas. So the incoherence of this, if you wanted to import an electric battery from China right now, you would pay 145% tariff. If you put that battery inside a Chinese laptop, you pay a 20% tariff. And if you put that Chinese-made battery inside a Vietnamese laptop, you pay a 10% tariff. So the incoherence of this, I think, is completely obvious. And so because they haven't figured out the rationale, they haven't figured out the right tariff plan, and because they haven't figured out the right set of tariffs, they in fact lack the leverage for what they want to do. So the latest call is, we're in this to strike deals. We're going to strike deals with all 192 other countries in the world within 90 days. Never mind that any individual trade deal usually takes 2 to 5 years. The problem with that is, if what you wanted to do was, say, strike a better deal with China, what you do is you'd bring your buddies close. You'd call Europe, you'd call the Brits, you'd call the Aussies, you'd call the Canadians, and you say, let's make sure our supply chains are in order so we've got alternatives if things get tough with China. Instead, what the United States is doing is fighting 192 separate trade wars. China is fighting one trade war. The European Union is fighting one trade war. The Aussies are fighting one trade war. And so what you get is, as a result, the Americans have a much worse bargaining position. This is not the art of the deal. Let me give a very nice example. Turns out the Chinese like eating American barbecue. So there's a Texas barbecue chain in China. Buys a lot of beef. Historically, it bought American beef. American beef just became incredibly expensive because of tariffs. They realized the Australians grow beef. So now you can go to a barbecue restaurant in China and eat Australian beef. What you're seeing there is that China has lots of options when it becomes hard to buy American beef. It can buy Australian beef. Americans don't have that many options. If we want to buy electronics, we've also got, Tim Cook is moving some iPhone production from China to India, but we've also got tariffs on India. And so our next best option from doing business with China just got a whole lot worse.
So what you're saying is all of this is really all of this essentially is hitting American citizens' pockets hardest.
Yes. So the biggest loser so far in this trade war, and it's really, my apologies to the rest of the world. I hold an American passport, and so to those of you outside our borders, I'm sorry. We didn't all vote for this. Most Americans are waking up and understanding how destructive this is. We saw the IMF recently, every 3 months does a round of forecasts. And so what's nice is you can compare its forecast today with that in January, which we all knew Trump was the incoming president, but he hadn't released the tariff madness. Basically, nothing else happened between those 3 months. And so you could think about how the IMF changed its forecasts as being what it thinks the effect of this policy madness is. So first of all, when I say I'm sorry to the rest of the world, I really mean that, which is economic growth in the rest of the world next year will be 0.5 percentage point lower, which will mean less income, less prosperity, and for many families, more struggles. For Americans, the effects are even larger. In fact, much larger. The two countries in the world most likely to suffer, who are forecast to suffer the most. First is actually Mexico, whose economy is tightly tied to that of the United States, and the second is the United States. There is pain in China, but it's less. And there's pain all around the world. So this is not anybody winning. But what Trump is effectively doing is holding the U.S. economy to ransom and showing, I'm willing to punch the American people in the face in order to get a better trade deal. And he's daring leaders in other countries, are you willing to do the same to your people? It may be that Europe decides it's not. So far it is. But I have a funny feeling that China's a little less democratically accountable even than the United States, and so a little more able to bear that pain.
The phrase that Scott Bessent used in his speech to the IIF Global Outlook Forum, he said that America first does not mean America alone. I guess my question is, from an economic point of view, what does it mean?
Well, America first is a slogan, but to the extent that it's translated into political actions, it's been to put up walls around America. It's going to be harder for Americans to do business, both buying and selling, with the rest of the world. And when we do business with people, we also meet them. We go for coffee. We look them in the eye. Sometimes we get to know their families. It's an amazing force for understanding peace and soft power beyond simply the fact that we're exchanging trinkets with each other. The wall that he's put up means, well, let me put it another way. When Russia invaded Ukraine and the rest of the world wanted to show its disapproval, it imposed sanctions on Russia. The idea was we'd cut off the Russian people from the rest of the world. They would find that so painful they would overthrow their government. Trump has imposed sanctions on the American people. It is now harder for us to do business with anyone in the rest of the world. I'm not quite sure I understand the theory by which it's a good way of punishing Russians and helping Americans.
So you say that he's imposed sanctions on the American people. I think earlier this week you also said that he has revealed a fundamental fragility in the American economy. Where exactly does that fragility lie?
Well, it's wonderful to talk to a Brit about this because you might understand some of this. We have a leader who, there's two fragilities I think are worth noting. One is at the level of the leader. We have a leader who I think is unfit for office. Others may disagree. That's their right. But it's a leader bringing forth an economic plan that's likely to cause immense and unhelpful destruction. That's a story that the Brits recognize. You had that once with Liz Truss. And we saw what happened with Liz Truss, which is you put a head of lettuce here and you put Liz Truss's career there. And the question is, which one goes off first? And it turns out British political institutions were strong enough to say no elected leader should be able to put the economic future of the country at jeopardy like this. That hasn't happened in America. So our political institutions don't have that same strength. We are not a parliamentary system. We're a presidential system. There are checks and balances. It turns out that most important parts of policy have to go through Congress. For historical reasons, Congress delegated a lot of this authority to the president. And Congress has gone quiet. I've not heard anything from Congress in months. I'm not even sure they're still alive inside that building. So that fragility suggests American political institutions aren't working the way that they do in other countries to prevent a power-drunk leader making idiosyncratic decisions. There's a second thing the American people have revealed. We elected this guy. Kind of can't forget that. Next time you want to do business with someone, you might think, well, before you do business with someone, you might think, well, what is their future political climate going to look like? And what we've shown is that the American people are willing to elect a leader who abrogates all responsibility, who refuses to live up to past trade deals, who is willing to tip the table in a fit of pique. I think they did that, the American people, because they're angry, and I understand some of that anger. But it's very hard for our foreign trading partners to forget that that is who we are. Now, again, I think there's actually kind of an interesting analogy with Britain, right? Brexit was basically an enormous middle finger to the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe, you'll form some trade relations with the rest of Europe, and you already are, but they'll never forget that. And that will always shape the future of your economic and political relationships with Europe.
I think the phrase that, as you said, a lot of Brits are familiar with, certainly what the opposition and Labour went with, was that Liz Truss crashed the economy, is what we always are told in the UK. I haven't seen sort of people using, that strong a language yet with Donald Trump.
Let me disagree. When you look at surveys of the American people, it's clear that they understand what's going on. Trump is losing the economic argument, and he's losing it enormously. So let me start with the data economists would look at. So if you look at people's expectations for the future path of the economy, consumer confidence has plummeted in the last 2 months faster than it ever has before. Business confidence has plummeted over the past 2 months, about as fast as it does during a global pandemic. If you ask people about what they expect inflation to be, it's risen faster over the past 2 months, faster than it ever has before. So that suggests that the argument that tariffs are going to cause price rises, which Trump has countered, that argument has been winning. If you look at expectations of whether the stocks will continue to rise or fall, the chances of a recession, and on and on and on and on, the American people appear to understand the precarious moment that they're in. If you look at public opinion polling on do you approve of Trump's management of the economy, it's sunk faster than it has in any presidential term in history. So the economy hasn't tanked. I should be clear about this. The economy is yet to tank. We see these soft data, these attitudes, and a lot of expectation and a lot of holding your breath and a lot of fear. But there's a lot going on. We came into this with a very, very rapid economic growth, an economy that was performing outstandingly well. And usually when an economy is doing well yesterday, it keeps doing well again tomorrow. And then all the economic data is going to get complicated because people are going to buy a bunch of stuff before the tariffs hit. And so that actually boosts spending in the short run. And so all of this may take a while. We still don't know whether it will filter through into slower growth or a recession. It's going to take a few months, but I think there's no confusing who to blame. And markets are telling us this very clearly. Every time Trump takes a step forward, markets tank. Every time he takes a step backward, they rise. So that also tells you this is not the view of one talking head from America. This is the consensus view of the very smart money on Wall Street.
You said we don't know yet. Are you willing to speculate at all on if we are approaching a global recession?
Let me take the question in two parts, which is a US recession and then a global recession. So my estimate is if nothing interesting had happened in the last 3 months, I think the chance of a recession this year would be about 10%. Normally it's about 14%, but the rest of the global economy seemed in pretty good shape. You know, there's no wars, pandemics, oil shocks. You know, there's bird flu, but they're chickens. So I'd say about a 10% chance normally. Since the madness started, if Trump were to walk every part of it back tomorrow and just say tariffs are back to where they were before, which was approximately zero, get back to work, I'm sorry. I think the chance of a recession this year would be 25%. And if he goes full steam ahead, I think the chance of a recession is 75%. And if he ends up somewhere in between, it's going to end up somewhere in between. Right now, betting markets say the chance of a recession is around about 60%. It's because Trump has backed down a little bit. That probably seems about right. I want to be clear, that doesn't mean it's certain. And it also doesn't mean I'm not worried. It means that recessions are really hard to predict. But for reasons that elude me, someone's moving all the pieces in just a way that it's made it more likely, not less.
I want to end just talking about Elon Musk. There was reports that he and Scott Bessent squared up to one another and got into a sweary shouting match, which was likened to a WWE wrestling bout. Who is in charge? Because it was about the Internal Revenue Service, the row.
Let me step out of my economist box for a moment and say, boy, this sounds a little like toxic masculinity, doesn't it? Let me step back into my economist box. Who is in charge? It's meant to be the president. Start there. It's also meant to be Congress, and it's also above that meant to be the Constitution. But actually, all of that's very much in doubt, and that's part of the current moment that we're in, which is frankly terrifying. Let me say a little bit about Elon Musk. First of all, I think it's hilarious that Elon Musk has discovered that it's too expensive for him to remain in government service. He can no longer afford it. Now, what has his contribution been? I think it's time to declare DOGE and Elon Musk an utter failure. And I want to be clear, I love government efficiency. I'm totally in favor of government efficiency. And I think going through and looking line by line and figuring out what we're getting right and what we're getting wrong and having no sacred cows and being willing to examine everything is exactly the right thing. But that's not what Musk did. What Musk did is if you actually look at the different parts of the budget, the parts that are most politically salient, say USAID, that's where he went. The parts where the most money is, he stayed away from. That's the IRS. Musk promised he would save, with all the brash bravado of a businessman, promised he would save the US government $2 trillion a year. So the first thing I want to say is every economist understood that was a lie, but I don't think he did. I think this is a disconnect, which is the business community does not understand how government works. Here's a very simple model for why I knew that was wrong from the start. There's an old saying that the federal government is an insurance company with an army. The insurance company is Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, Social Security, and so on. The army, well, it's the army. You might say, where are all the other functions of government, schools and roads and that? They're all state. So then once you know it's an insurance company with an army and we're not going to touch the army, basically the federal government is one big check receiving operation. We call that the IRS, and a check printing operation. That's basically what it is. And so there's a couple of guys employed to make sure the printer doesn't jam. And so if you look at a program like Social Security, literally hundreds of billions of dollars and a skeleton staff next to it. So the idea that the waste was going to come from firing the people, these are just the people who keep the printer running. The question is, what checks do you want to print? That's a much harder question. So he said he'd save $2 trillion. So the visual metaphor I like to use is a football field. It's 100 meters long in America. So 2 trillion is 2,000 billion. So that means each yard on that football field is $20 billion. Musk went from 2 trillion promising 1 trillion. So he went to the halfway line as the new goal line. Then he claims to have saved 150 billion by next year. But if you look at his wall of receipts, it's actually about 60 billion. That wall of receipts is almost has got so many flaws. There's been article after article about how they're making up facts, cancelling contracts that were worth no dollars, that they appear not to understand how government accounting works. But even if we took that seriously, 60 billion means on that football field of savings is at the 3-yard line. Basically, Musk got nothing done. And the reality is he's probably at the 2-yard line. And then when we say he got to the 2-yard line, even that sounds pretty bad, but realize almost nothing of what he saved was waste, fraud, and abuse. When you shut down USAID, which is a way we chose to spend our money, we thought that it was a way of living up to our values and spreading soft power. If you just stop doing that, that's not stopping waste, fraud, and abuse. We're no longer getting the cost of that, but we're also no longer getting the benefit. And most of what Musk was doing that. So he turned out to be the useful idiot who was able to pretend that politically targeted attacks were about waste, fraud, and abuse. I don't know how much people understand. In fact, he failed at that task.
Joining me is Malcolm Nance, former US Naval Intelligence. Malcolm, thank you so much for coming on the Trump Report.
Well, it's always exciting to be on the Trump Report. It's not like we don't have anything to talk about.
No, absolutely not. It's always a pleasure to have you. And I do actually want to start talking to you about Trump's ambitions for Greenland, because you're currently speaking to me from Copenhagen after visiting Greenland before that. What have you learned on your trip?
Well, people ask me, they go, why are you going to Greenland, right? You were Middle East, Southwest Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, terrorism expert, but I also was explainer in chief, as the intelligence and counterterrorism analyst for NBC News for 6 or so years. Then, of course, I went to Ukraine, joined the Ukrainian army. So that sort of made me an on-the-ground expert in Russia, Ukraine, considering as I risk my life every day for almost a year. But before I went to Ukraine, as to join the army, I was there for almost 5 weeks, almost a month, over a month, studying the groundwork and the way that Russian forces were positioned, and to make a determination if the Russian invasion back in 2022, if the invasion which happened in February 2022 was actually going to happen. And there's only one way that you can learn that. I mean, you can study it academically, you can look at OSINT, you can watch propaganda videos, but you have to be on the ground. And to learn and understand anything, you have to know the terrain, you have to know the culture, you have to know the people, You have to know language. You have to understand the politics and the history of the place that you're carrying out that operation. So I went to Ukraine. I had studied Russian before. I went there. I started learning Ukrainian, which is different than Russian. Culturally different people, even though they were under the Soviet Union. So that gave me the ability to look at that situation from the ground, even from the Russian perspective. We drove down every highway that we knew Russia would have to invade on. And I came with the determination about 2 weeks into it that this thing was going to happen. Russia was going to invade Ukraine. There was just no way around it. Same thing's happening here with Greenland. I had been watching over time the comments from the Trump campaign at first. And twice Donald Trump said something that caught my attention. And one of them was, we are going to expand the territory of the United States greatly. I just thought, what? you know, we're pretty big right now. But it means he had territorial ambitions somewhere. Then he started making his 51st state joke, which was not a joke. Incorporating Canada's 51st state. And by January, he started making open, blatant statements the United States would take Greenland. Not, he kept saying annex. And I think people get misguided by the phrase annex. Um, Annex means that you're going to either incorporate it in such a way that you just surrender in the face of overwhelming power, or it's seized through the use of power. And what I learned in Greenland was this: one, the country is massive. Okay. It is not a small country. It's, well, yeah, it's the biggest island in the world because, I guess, you know, during the period, the Pangaean period, it broke off of the entire east coast of the Canada and the United States, and over a billion years drifted up there to be an independent island, right? If it had been attached to the United States, it would be what it is, right? It's just 2,500 kilometers long, right? And almost 1,000 wide, and 90% of that country is under 1 mile, 2.2 kilometers of solid ice. And you can look at it, and everywhere you see white, that's not snow. That is ice that goes back to the Ice Age in many instances. So the western coast, southwestern coast, where at times it's inhabitable. And here's another thing, I get this error from many Americans, and the Trump administration said this. They said that there would be a shared culture between the Inuit of Alaska and the Inuit of Greenland, who they claim came over a few hundred years ago. Not at all. The Greenlandic people, the Kalisut, they have been there for 4,500 years. They have digs there, same hunting tools for seal and whale and narwhal, same flints that they were using up until the 1800s. An amazingly deep culture, but a culture rooted on one thing and one thing only: surviving the environment, which is the second thing I learned there. That environment will smack you right in the face. Whatever your plans or ideas are for travel, well, you better throw in. They say maybe, right? That's one of their national words. Maybe, maybe you can do it if Mother Nature and Mother of the Sea allow it, and those are two important factors.
You said when you visited Ukraine, you got the sense that this invasion sort of was coming. So while
Yeah.
you were in Greenland, I mean, maybe we won't use the word invasion, but obviously you used the words taken and annexing. Did you get a sense that something is going to happen?
Well, first off, what I got a sense of was that there's no just asking for Greenland. Okay. Again, our base that we have in the northern part, we've had bases in Greenland since 1941, right? We transshipped bombers and all sorts of things to Russia over Greenland. There are relics of those bases The bases are there. There's relics of those fuel cans, old trucks, just abandoned there. We had bases in the Cold War, and what is was back then Thule Air Base, and and we actually had a secret underground nuclear missile base that was powered by a nuclear reactor, Camp Century. Um, they sort of went out of fashion as advances in technology happened in the Cold War. We still operate Thule Base, which is now called Patufic Space Base. That monitors radars and space-based sensors, and that's it. But that base is literally 900 miles to the capital Nook, due south over a 1 mile deep sheet of ice. So, it's an adventurous place. And oh, by the way, that's not even the northernmost base up there. Right? The Danes operate, what do they call it? Camp Nord, which is they have their dog sled patrols are up there. They have a deep ice core drilling program up there. They're using part of that terrain as experiments for Mars. So you're not even near the deepest part of the deep Arctic. You might be at 66 degrees north or something, but hey, it's pretty far up there. So that's important to know that our capabilities are nowhere near there, but the people are really the most important factor there. Peaceful, no history of intertown or even there's no tribes, right? These are the same people. The Kalia, that's how they pronounce it. I had to try to learn Greenlandic while I was up there. And they have no history of animosity. Of course, you have the general human things. There was no tribal warfare, right? The town of Pamiat didn't get into their boats and row over to, another town and attempt to take it over, rape, burn, pillage to get their sealskins. They didn't do that. Everything up there was about survival, right up until the arrival of, Eric the Red, who set up in 982 the first Scandinavian presence on Greenland, and they have been there ever since. So both cultures.
When you mentioned the bases there, we know that one of the reasons the US holds so much interest in the country is, sort of stems from national security concerns regarding Russia and China, and that is the US Pituffik Space Base, I think is how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
That would be really important in defending the US against, any attacks that come over the Arctic Circle, perhaps. I wanted to ask, after being there, are those purely American fears, or do the people of Greenland also have those concerns?
If anyone's watching, I'm laughing, right? Um, I've spent decades in U.S. intelligence, and I've been in wars. Several major invasions, counterterrorism wars, counterinsurgencies, naval combat. Um, Exactly who are we defending from? Because it's not Donald Trump and Russia, because those two entities are like peas in a pod. Okay. Also, is it me or is it 1962 again? I mean, are we living in a Tom Clancy novel or some Robert Ludlum spy thriller where watching the radar environment, the radar scope of covering Russia in case they secretly launch, 500 ballistic missiles with atomic warheads on the top. And that base is going to give you the warning that that's coming. Well, you can do that from Western Maryland. You can do that from Florida. You can do that from a submarine that is at periscope depth and can get a satellite feed, right? That base is an anachronism. Now, granted, I have not been to the base, but I absolutely know what it does. I absolutely know how it was integrated. I pulled a short tour at a National Nuclear Command Post once. I also know that the Canadians operate the alert radar system chain in their Arctic. So, I mean, I got to be honest with you, right? If the end were to come, right, we would be at the end of a 23-minute till the end of the world um, scenario. Well, if Russia was actually boosting things that are a threat to the national security into space in the United States, you could literally go out the door of the base and look up and get a visual identification that there are hundreds of ballistic missiles airborne. So, precisely, what is the national security interest of the United States that they're looking at? They are saying it is actually the sea lanes that are there. Now, I'm an old school guy. I'm a grandpa spy. Um, I remember back in the oldie days of the Cold War, in which it was 10 years before the Soviet Union collapsed or so, that we really watched the Soviet naval threat. I mean, I'm a Navy guy. And no matter where you were in the world, you had to watch the Soviet Navy. And the scenario of the Soviet Navy and its submarines doing a blitz sortie out of Murmansk, heading down past Svalbard, where we had sensors, and then entering the GIUK, right? The the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. So because they wouldn't go near Norway, they would go north into that gap and then flood the North Atlantic. This scenario was seen in Hunt for Red October, right? The movie, the Tom Clancy novel. And we kept great eyes on that. We don't have to do that now. Soviet Navy or the Russian Navy is a fraction of the size of the Soviet Navy. It doesn't even have the capability of getting out of port or even getting up to steam without us knowing it, using real sensors in real time where we can track you. Submarines aren't as stealthy as they think they are in the world of modern technology. So if it's not that, then what is it? And what I'm hearing from their version of experts, what the people they want to call experts, is that it's really about the Northwest Passage, which passes through the Davis Strait, which is you go through to Greenland, right? You pass through the Davis Strait, then you get up into the Arctic islands of Banff, and then you get into the Arctic Sea itself, which is still seasonal. Uh, but what would be the purpose of that? Is it to break the ice and access minerals up there, oil, natural gas, or whatever? That would take a Herculean effort. I mean, you would have to commit $1 trillion to go up and get resources that right now are buried under the Arctic Sea. Here's the problem. Their calculation is that they're going to allow climate change to let it melt. Now, Manhattan may have something to say about that. The Maldives may have something to say about that. But where is the logic in this? So, as an intelligence professional, a geopolitical analyst, I do not see the rationale. There's no Chinese up there, by the way. None. Well, there's not even Chinese restaurants run by Filipinos. So, what are they talking about? There is something else at play here. I have a suspicion of what it is because they talk about it.
Are you willing
You know,
to talk about that suspicion?
sure. There is an ideology that is burning through Washington right now called dark enlightenment. And it is the weirdest thing you will ever hear outside of like ISIS. And it is a tech bro philosophy, which was pushed by these multi-millionaire guys in Silicon Valley who admire this philosopher hippie king called Curtis Yarvin, who believes that the United States should not be a democracy or a representative republic. It should use advanced technologies and transform itself into a technet of America. This philosophy started in the 1930s, right? Mechanico and whole Metropolis, iRobot thing. And it sounds crazy, right? It sounds fantastical, futurist stuff. And a key component of this tech bro world is that the United States must expand physically in order to get the natural resources to take us to Mars and beyond. Um, and in their 1930s philosophy, it was supposed to encompass from like Ecuador to the North Pole. In the white supremacist, racist tech bro world, it goes from the Rio Grande to through Canada to the North Pole and all of Greenland. And these people have been pushing. Greenland is full of riches that the tech world could use. I mean, to have data centers require enormous amounts of fresh water. And they, hey, put it on the Russell Glacier near Kangerlussuaq, right? Just move all that up there, and you could have data centers that are 20 miles long. Another weird component of this, and is the belief that these tech bros should create technologically advanced cities for the tech bros to go and create these, pseudo anarchic, non democratic societies. They're experimenting with this in Latin America by planning these cities, and they had one plan for Greenland,
Because we should
right?
say, at the moment, obviously, officially, this is not government policy.
It's not government policy, but it's being affected everywhere. To the point, look, when the New York Times finally wakes up and says Curtis Yarvin's crazy philosophy is now running Washington, D.C., it's pretty much official that it's running what DOGE, and firing all the government workers was a Curtis Yarvin philosophy. He called RAGE, RAGE, remove all government employees, and you were supposed to replace them with AI and advanced automation. So this philosophy was supposed to create a thing called the TechNet of America, and it requires the annexation of Canada and its people and Greenland and all its resources and riches. Crazy, right? Well, I have the president of the United States who controls 4,500 atomic bombs and the largest military in history talking seriously about this.
And do you think we actually will see that sort of push ahead in Greenland?
Look, bro, if there's anything I've learned in my career, I mean, helped affect two invasions. I have been in lots of defensive wars and terrorism wars. When it gets quiet, someone's loading ammunition. Now, we know there is an actual plan in effect. And we know that because very serious reporting has happened. Not only that, Donald Trump sent his son up there. He started shouting about it. They started looking for opposition figures to back. They, they garnered an enormous, massive protest there, like 3,000 people out of a city of 18,000, where you literally know everybody is pretty bad. So but then we started getting reporting that they had developed, the White House had ordered a plan to financially uh, calculate how much it would cost the United States to absorb 57,000 people and that territory into our country. And then we started getting a pushback, which had to have come from Mike Waltz, the national security advisor. 10 days after that Washington Post article, a New York Times article comes out and says, yeah, we have a plan. We want to do this peacefully. We don't plan on using force. But yes, there is a plan and it's underway. Okay. When those plans don't pan out and something bad happens to Donald Trump, he is very irrational. I speak to his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, every week in a podcast we do, which we call him and Lev Parnas. We call two felons and a spy. And they say no, Trump will not use force. That's not his thing. But then he caveats it and goes, this guy in the White House is not the guy that I worked for 15 years. He has people and currents around him which are making him do things that he really thinks he's an emperor. And he may decide, I will expand the United States more than Thomas Jefferson and the president who expanded it the most, who is most noteworthy for it, James K. Polk, right? Who no one remembers. But he did expand everything west of the Mississippi. Trump has this in his head now. And the only question is, as his plans fail politically, will he decide that a very short 24-hour US Denmark war, because that's what it would be, seizing Greenland, you would have to go around. They have naval assets there. They have two corvettes and a frigate, and they're not small ships, and they're highly capable of defending that town if they had to. Are we planning on doing that? Are you gonna the cops in Nuuk are all rotated from Denmark. They're not Greenlandic cops. They're like 50 guys, young guys who are from Copenhagen, who go there for a tour to protect the towns and out in there, and then they rotate back home. Could you imagine U.S. troops having them at gunpoint? It would be like the first day of the Falkland Islands invasion by the Argentinians. It's a, I'm going to caveat it this way too. This is the stupidest thing I have ever had to analyze, by the way, without any question. The very fact that we're talking about it is mind-boggling. But the president of the United States brought his stupid concept and has now created a stupid reality that NATO, Denmark, and the people of Greenland now have to calculate in their day-to-day life.
I want to move on slightly to someone you've already mentioned, and that is Elon Musk. Now, we haven't actually seen much of him over the last month, but he spoke at the Qatar Economic Forum last night, where he said that he's committed to staying as Tesla's CEO for the next 5 years, but he will cut back on his political spending, saying, I think I've done enough. I mean, is it over for him in the White House?
He couched that. At the end of his statement, he came back and said, I think I've done enough. And then he said, but if I think I need to spend more, I will.
Because we should say he spent over $250 million in the presidential campaign, is what's reported.
$250 million is the interest income on his money for about 10 minutes. So it's the equivalent of, not even you getting a half pint of shandy in your day-to-day world for a year.
We've reacted to this meeting between Trump and President Zelensky, and then Trump, Zelensky, and these European leaders. So there's so much to discuss and go through today. It seems to have been a very positive meeting if we compare it to February's ambush of President Zelensky, so to speak, what we got out of it, what Zelensky succeeded in, and what is left to do. Of course, potentially have a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Trump says that is now on the cards potentially within 2 weeks. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube page, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at the University of College Dublin, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Maddie, it's so great to be here today.
Scott, you were on Frontline last night with immediate reactions to the meeting between Trump, Zelensky, and then the other meeting with the European leaders. But of course, you also need to show face on the Trump Report as we react to what happened last night. Now, I want to kick off with your immediate reaction. This was a far cry from what we saw in February. So would you call this a success for Ukraine? And would you say it was a step in the right direction?
Not just a success for Ukraine, it's a big win. And I mean big win for Ukraine and for Europe. Whether it'll stick, because, I've been using this analogy past few days. Trump is a yo-yo, and it depends on who's pulling the string. Whether it'll stick over the next few days establishes whether this big win is a lasting win. Let me give you my quick talking points, because when I talked to Frontline last night, it was just after the Zelensky appearance with Trump in the presser, but it was during Trump's meeting with the Europeans, the 7 European leaders as well as Trump. So it's moved on a bit since then. The big win was in part presentation. A lot of people are going to talk about that today. How Zelensky, after being ambushed by J.D. Vance in late February and then by Trump, after what really are pro-Trump attack. They're not actually journalists. They're attack commentators who are set up to ask questions. The guys like, why aren't you wearing a suit? They were there yesterday as well. But Zelensky navigated Trump. And Trump was in a bad mood when that press conference started. He'd been, spouting off on Truth Social all day. And he was rambling about the media. He was rambling about the Biden administration. At one point, he went on for minutes about the evil of mail-in ballots that are going to doom us all to hell, apparently. And Zelensky just sat there and let him roll with that. Then when the attack guys came in, why aren't you having elections? And Zelensky said, well, our Constitution doesn't permit elections. As soon as we get a truce, then we'll bring, democracy. People will have a right to choose. At which point Trump tries I think it was a joke. I hope it was a joke, which fell flat, which is, oh, so you don't have elections because of martial law. Well, in 3.5 years, it's like, oh, good. Donald, who's been putting the National Guard out on the streets of Washington and then is threatening to do it on other cities, is saying, maybe I can stick around in the White House by declaring martial law in 28. Fortunately, I think people are so stunned that line died pretty quickly. Anyway, Zelensky's navigating that. And then what he's doing is, first of all, on style points, that letter that he hands Trump from his wife, Elena Zelenska, which is to Melania Trump. Kudos. I mean, what it's going to do is it establishes a bond there, because Melania Trump has been going to Donald and saying Putin's killing civilians. And that letter that Melania sent to Alaska last Friday was about Putin deporting the Ukrainian children. The situation that he's up on charges for before the ICC. And so, you get that connection, which is there. Substance, though, which we want to get to, is what happened at that presser is, I think, two key points, because the background is that we know that Putin had manipulated Trump, pulled the string on the yo-yo, where Trump is no longer talking about a ceasefire and he's no longer talking about toughened sanctions. So what do? Zelensky and the Europeans, first of all, say, okay, if we're not going to talk about ceasefire, let's set the terms for an agreement and focus on security guarantees. And those two words, they were pushing them all weekend. And for the first time, Trump administration is backing security guarantees. Just in principle, the details aren't established yet, although Zelensky has handed across, a written document to try to establish it. But, here's Trump saying, we're going to provide protection, we're going to be involved, Europeans will take the lead, but we're there. That's a major advance. And if you recall, Maddie, when Trump and Vance went ballistic on Zelensky back in February, that's what the Europeans had been working on. That's what Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron were putting on with the so-called coalition of the willing, was the security guarantees. 6 months later, they think they've got it. And here's the tip-off. Keir Starmer, at the later meeting where the Europeans are present, refers to NATO-style guarantees. Now, that's key. It's key for two reasons. One is Ukraine doesn't want just like, oh, yeah. If Russia attacks, that'll be a bad thing. They had that in the Budapest Memorandum back in 1994 when they gave up nuclear weapons. They had it early this century. They had it in the Minsk agreements. And Putin still went ahead and invaded, right? They want something which is much more binding than that. And secondly, NATO style. You don't say that. Starmer doesn't go public with that unless he thinks they've got it on the way to being locked in. Because that means, of course, just a quick reminder, NATO's Article 5, one member gets attacked, everybody comes in to defend. Okay. Second breakthrough is to get Putin into the same room as Zelensky, to get him face to face, followed up by a trilateral meeting with Trump. And Zelensky introduces it in the presser with Trump. Trump says, yeah, good. And we know Trump loves this because this is Trump's photo op. What that does with Putin is it puts him into a corner. Either Putin has to accept the meeting with Zelensky face to face, in which case he is for the first time recognizing Zelensky as a legitimate president, and he's recognizing that government is legitimate rather than trying to overthrow it. Or he rejects that meeting and he risks upsetting Trump by looking like the bad guy, that he's the one that doesn't want to end the war. So Kremlin hasn't made an official response today. And we can talk about their specific signals if you want. But anyway, Zelensky establishes those wins. Then you get the Europeans who are there, and they're all there for certain reasons. Each of those 7 is serving a role. And Trump doesn't wander off and back into Putin's pocket. He does say no ceasefire, because why would you need a ceasefire when I've solved 6 wars already? Nobody laughed out loud at that comment, which you and I would. They just said, oh, yeah. And they just kept the focus on those security guarantees. And we didn't know why till this morning, Trump interrupted the meeting to go call Putin, apparently for 40 minutes. And it looks like he was calling Putin to say, why don't you meet up with Vladimir? Why don't you meet up with Vladimir and then we'll all meet together? So he's working on him to accept this meeting. So at this point, and I do stress those words, at this point, what we've got are two things. One is generally Ukraine and Europe have regained the initiative with Trump. They've regained the political initiative. Secondly, they've begun to set concrete terms in terms of where the end of this invasion lands. And I'll just remind the break on this because this is the reality for Ukraine. And I know some of our Ukrainian friends don't like to hear this. Zelensky and Europe are pretty much, accepting that you've got short-term Russian occupation in Crimea and in parts of east and southern Ukraine. There will be, however, no legal recognition of any of those areas as Russian territory, and there will be no giveaway of further territory, especially in the northern Donetsk region. But while Ukraine has to accept that short-term Russian occupation, they move closer to Europe and the US economically and militarily. Back to that analogy that I've used with you and with your great colleagues, rough analogy, West Germany, East Germany, Cold War. East Germany goes into the Soviet sphere of influence, but West Germany moves from strength to strength politically and economically as it becomes part of Europe.
Let's stay on this security guarantees now. Just before we get into that, I want to just highlight the fact that what you're saying before is that, Zelensky, he wore a suit, he laughed at the jokes, he observed when he had to, he let Trump speak about mail-in ballots, rigged elections, as you said. Clearly, he was more prepared to deal with Trump. I don't know if he had that meeting in Brussels the other day, or he's had further phone calls with several members of the coalition of the willing, and they have prepped him on how to avoid what happened in February, Scott. I don't know if that was your takeaway from it.
Well, I mean, the broader story, Maddie, is since the disaster at the end of February, not just on the specifics of handling Trump, but on the broader of regaining the initiative, this has been a huge story. And I know, and quite often we criticize Europe for moving slowly, bureaucratically. It can be frustrating at times. This is a huge success story of the Europeans working with Zelensky when they've been under great pressure. And I've already talked about how the whole goal was to get the security guarantees. Well, in the past couple of weeks, when Trump was really fed up with Putin because Putin keeps killing Ukrainian civilians, Zelensky and the Europeans kept working on this. How do we maneuver this to our advantage? But they had to deal with that fact that on Friday in Alaska, this was Putin's last card, his last best card, which was the face-to-face with Trump. And you and I are sitting there looking at it going, geez, Trump just got absolutely crushed by Putin. Well, Zelensky and the Europeans know that as well, but they don't take their eye off the ball. Look, this isn't a lost cause. And what they did is, you're exactly right. They talked about how do you deal with Trump getting back into the White House on Monday, and they also kept the focus on those security guarantees because U.S. officials were talking about them. Because, here's the wider success, Maddie, they haven't been just talking about how amongst themselves, they've been talking with U.S. officials as well. Keith Kellogg, I actually saw him yesterday. Keith Kellogg was actually standing next to a couple of the attack journalists. He was standing next to one of them from Fox TV. He didn't say a word. He didn't really want to be seen. But Kellogg's been talking to Ukraine and Europe about how do you handle Trump? How do you make sure that that we just don't bail out and leave Ukraine alone? And the outcome of this is that Zelensky, and by the way, one other thing, a lot of people blame Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, who is a character who's quite full of himself and who they say didn't prepare Zelensky adequately in February. Yermak's not around yesterday, right? You're not seeing him publicly. Zelensky is there prepped by better officials, prepped by the Europeans. And what happens as a result? J.D. Vance doesn't say a word.
Scott, we're gonna get into JD Vance. I'm gonna pause that because I want to give that a lot of highlights. So I want to give a bit of a tease for our audience before we get into JD Vance, because just before we move off security guarantees, you and I have spoken about this a little bit, either on Sunday when we had our first chat after the meeting, or even off camera. Now I want to talk about this security guarantees. This felt like out of the question 6 months ago that you would have the United States giving guarantees for protection for Ukraine. Now, just to preface, we're not quite sure what territory swap or grab has been given. That's a conversation between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky. We know that there's potential for Donbass. We obviously know about Crimea, but right now we're not quite sure. But this is what Trump said. He said, when it comes to security, there's going to be a lot of help, adding that Europeans would be involved. He said they are the first line of defense because they're there, but we'll help them out. We don't know about boots on the ground, but we know he's committed to protection. Now, here is where it gets complicated, because Zelensky clearly doesn't want just verbal agreement. So he goes out to the press after this meeting and he says, we'll have this formalized on paper within the next 10 days, and also said that Ukraine had offered to buy about $90 billion worth of US weapons. So when he goes out to the press and says formalized on paper, it shows that he's not playing around. He's not relying on verbal agreement from Trump and his administration. He is saying, I want this written on paper that can outlast presidencies to come, where I'm not relying on Donald Trump's word today. I'm not relying on the quietness of this meeting together. I'm going straight to the press to say, this is what we agreed on. Within 10 days, this is going to be on paper.
Yeah, I'm going to give you the exclusive story in just a minute. Just before that, though, let's talk about that territory, because we need to set that up. Trump keeps talking about territory swapping territory, and this is the fly in the ointment here, because there ain't no territory swap here.
Yeah, swap is the wrong word, Scott, and I think it's an offensive word to be using.
Yeah, and everybody's not going to say it to Trump's face. They don't want to, lose him. But the reality here is Russia's not giving up any territory. What the question here is, as we mentioned a minute ago, is whether you freeze the front lines where they are, or whether Russia seizes more Ukrainian territory. And that northern part of Donetsk is the key part to watch there. Why does Russia want it so much? It's fortified. It's fortified towns. It's key in terms of support of military positions. So not only if Russia gets it, does it make it tougher for Ukraine to ever get that area back, the east back, but Russia opens up the possibility, as the Europeans have been telling Trump, of the highway to Kyiv if they were to invade again. So I'm going to tell you right now, there's no way that Ukraine is giving up that territory that they hold. There is no way that's happening. And for those people, because I love our commenters, I love each and every one of you who keep saying, Russia's winning, Russia's going to take it. Have a look yesterday, folks, at a report by one of the best war monitors out there, which is called Deep State. Russia now has about 19% of Ukraine, right, that they occupy. In November 2022, Russia held about 18% of Ukraine. That means that in 2.5 years, more than 2.5 years, Russia has advanced through 1%, 0.97 of 1% to be exact, of Ukrainian territory. So they're not rolling Ukraine over. So the territory is key here, because if Trump flips back, if Putin can yo-yo him into saying, no, Russia has to have this territory in Donetsk, that's the deal breaker. And everything collapses. But let's assume for the moment that Trump doesn't go into Putin's pocket on this. What are those security guarantees that we're talking about? And here's where the exclusive comes in. U.S. press is going off on one, which is it troops on the ground? Is it U.S. troops on the ground? Because Americans always worry about sending their boys to places on the ground ever since Iraq 2003. Don't need U.S. troops there. Europeans have said they'll provide manpower. Now, the manpower, not on the front line with Russia necessarily, protecting Ukraine's defense facilities, including the drone manufacturing plants. They've said that for months. If there's a buffer zone established between the Russian zone of occupation and the Ukrainian lines, we'll see which forces are in there, but I suspect, first and foremost, it'll be Ukrainian forces that are patrolling. Now, what do the Americans bring to the table? Intelligence sharing, logistics, engineering, transport, equipment, and weapons, albeit equipment and weapons that they sell to NATO members to then provide to Ukraine. Weapons which include air defenses, if Russia continues the attack from the air or tries to resume them, as well as vital material on the ground. So the Americans bring all that lifting in that you don't necessarily need American troops to provide. You might need American support personnel in there, but that's a different matter from what you're talking about in terms of frontline forces. So that definitely can be brought in there. Now, why do I say that there's a story behind this? Whenever leaders meet, it's not just leaders who meet. They also bring their officials and their staffs to meet. And those meetings go on. And what was happening yesterday, even while these other meetings go on, is that the European and Ukrainian military representatives were talking to the Americans in meetings that were led by the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Dan Kane. Those meetings would have discussed elements of those security guarantees that are being referred to out in public, out front. And here's the tip-off of where you get success politically alongside those meetings. You just referred to the fact that Zelensky said this has to be a binding and long-term relationship. Remember this line from Trump's presser with Zelensky. This can't be something which is just for 2 years. This has got to last. So the American officials who are working with the Europeans, working with the Ukrainians, get into Trump's ear and emphasize that. You've got to have, this is not a temporary commitment. Now, again, I want to hold out that caveat. Trump is unpredictable. He's chaotic. If the Russians can figure out a way to yo-yo him back, they will. I'm feeling a little bit more optimistic than I would have at any point in the past few months because I'm not sure where the Russian option is to pull him back. And for all you folks up there, I don't think the Epstein files are the way the Russians are going to do it.
Scott, do you think that this move from Zelensky to make sure it was written down was his smartest move yet from yesterday?
I think it's a great move, but I want to emphasize it's a coordinated move. I really want to emphasize that you've got Zelensky as the public face, and we understand why. This is Europeans, Ukrainians, political, military, economic people that are all trying to lock down in a way that they lock something down that almost everybody's forgotten about. The controversial minerals deal between the U.S. and Ukraine that was ripped apart with the February disaster when Zelensky was in the White House, but then it was restored. The importance of that mineral deal is not actually that minerals are going to be given or sold to the United States in the near future. Those minerals aren't going to appear for quite some time. That written deal locked the U.S. into being invested in Ukraine's future economically. So you got that locked down through the written deal. You now have to get the written and political arrangements locked in. And when you do that, then you can go to the table with Putin in terms of a settlement from a position of strength rather than a position of uncertainty.
Scott, sorry, just on the note of this, on this investment in Ukraine, Donbass, if it's handed over, obviously we've got Donetsk and Luhansk. If it is handed over to Russia, as you mentioned, that's considered the industrial heartland of Ukraine. A lot of coal mining, a lot of steel. So is it not in the US's interest to be keeping that with Ukraine? And
a lot of minerals there, potentially. Absolutely right. And this is what, and I think if I remember the latest statistics, I think Russia holds around about 75% of the Donetsk region. They hold almost all of Luhansk. They hold about...
Yeah, you're right. 88% of Donbass, 75% of it being Donetsk, and about all of Luhansk.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's that 25% of Donetsk that Ukraine has held on to after 42 months, that's key. That's absolutely key from an economic and a military standpoint. So again, always remember that while Trump is chaotic and certain, we're not just talking about Trump, we're talking about Trump administration. So you've got to look at the economic, the military, and the political officials and say, are they going to be happy handing over all of Donetsk to the Russians? And they're not. With exceptions like the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, who fortunately didn't say a word yesterday because everything he says turns out to be half-assed.
Scott, let's move on. Well, I've only got a little bit left, and I want to speak about what your thoughts just quickly on how likely you think it will happen that Putin agrees to this meeting between him and Zelensky, a one-on-one, and then a trilateral meeting with Donald Trump afterwards.
I don't know. I honestly don't know because they're playing for time is what they're doing today, Maddie, to give you the latest. So on the one hand, there were messages in the Russian state media, let me get this right, of TASS featuring Emmanuel Macron saying that the meeting could be in Geneva or that the meeting could be in Istanbul. So Russian state media is at least saying there's the possibility that this would happen. On the other hand, Dmitry Medvedev, either because it's a calculated move by the Kremlin or he's gotten into the vodka cabinet again, has gone off on one on social which is all about the the European warmongers, the anti-Russian warmongers, and they came in and tried to play Trump, but they failed, yada 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 yada, which is a bit of a hard line to take. I'd say watch for the signals. I would say up to now, I ruled this out from happening because I'll come back to the fundamental point. When Russia refers to the root causes of the war, which are their terms for settling, it's not just seizing more than 20% of Ukraine, including these areas we talked about. It's not just lifting the sanctions on Moscow. It's not just keeping Ukraine weak. It is that the Zelensky government has to be removed. They do not recognize that government. Well, Putin is going to have to, either way, if he meets with Zelensky, he's having to back down. He may not openly admit it, but he's having to back down from that. On the other hand, if you reject this meeting, you've slapped Trump in the face. I don't know how you spin Trump on refusing to meet Zelensky, especially, and this is the other element to watch, especially if Russia is continuing the missile and drone attacks, and they have continued the missile and drone attacks overnight. In fact, the overnight attacks this morning, I think there were a few hundred drones that they fired and about 10 missiles. And that's one of the largest attacks that Russia's had this month. Look, if you keep killing Ukraine civilians, you're going to upset Trump. That's why he started to threaten the sanctions. So I think at the least, Putin's got to consider meeting Zelensky. I keep wondering why he doesn't back off of the attacks. And if he doesn't, what do you do? You give Trump a pony? I have no clue where Russia's flattery of Trump goes next, because they made the big move in Alaska.
They're at the end of the road, the end of the road on flattering Trump, because his patience has run dry.
I think so. I think so. I honestly, and I know, and I'm going to respond to our great viewers out there who come back, and I respect exactly what they say, because I thought Putin can always spin Trump, he can always pull him around, and I respect it, but I don't think that is always 100% given. Like I said, Trump is just simply not in the same position as he was when he came into office back in January.
Hey, Mr. Breton Gordon, a former British Army colonel, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Last Friday, Hamish, the White House published its 33-page 2025 National Security Strategy, which basically outlined an assertive America First approach focused on US sovereignty, reducing global commitments, and prioritizing domestic strength. So it also sharply criticized Europe, demands that allies take more control of their own defense. The strategy also adopts a softer stability-focused stance towards Russia, emphasizing that negotiated ends to conflicts rather than treating Moscow as America's primary threat. So what was your reaction to this strategy, Hamish, and the fact that the Kremlin responded to the document saying that it was largely consistent with Russia's vision?
I think it's very interesting. I think the timing of it was also interesting, given that we're in the middle of, really complex peace negotiations, ceasefire negotiations between the Americans, the Russians, and the Ukrainians. I think, when you look at it at first sight, as it were, I think for those of us in Europe, it was pretty disappointing. On the European case, I think absolutely the Americans are spot on there, that we in Europe must take much more responsibility for the security of Europe, and the fact that all European countries are now rearming and reconfiguring their military to make sure that we can protect ourselves. That has been a good thing, and I think President Trump has made that happen, and that is a positive. However, when you look at it outside of that, and the fact that Peskov, the Russian spokesman, has welcomed it so warmly, I mean, lots of people are again saying it's a bit like the 28-point peace plan that we were discussing 2 weeks ago or so. It seems to have Russian DNA all over it. And when you look at the American defense strategy, again, the mood music coming out of the States, as you say, very much inwardly focused, and seeing more of threats in the East, the Far East, China, than actually Russia itself. And also the articulation that the Americans want to do business with the Russians, and as you say, a much softer approach. So, in the middle of really difficult, heated peace negotiations, if I was President Putin, I'd be a lot happier than if I was President Zelensky or indeed the European NATO countries. So I think, again, the timing and I suppose in a way we've sort of got used to this from President Trump and his government really sometimes doing things that do not seem sensible to any of us here in Europe, but they are looking for a greater gain there. But I think it does really give the Russians a bit of a fillip here. We were hoping that the key issue that seems to be on the peace negotiation table is the Donbass, and President Zelensky, who's just arrived in London, has reiterated that, yet been absolutely clear that the Donbass are not for sale to the Russians, and that for him is a red line. Whereas President Trump, I think, suggested last night that Zelensky was being a bit intransigent here, and sort of handing the initiative to the Russians, which just doesn't go well this side of the Atlantic. So I think we are all feeling a little bit less safe after the US defense strategy came out last Friday than safer.
And we'll get into the Donbass and how that really is a critical and crucial part of brokering the deal. But for right now, when this strategy came out, Hamish, Republican Congressman Don Bacon, he's been, as of late, opposing the US's approach to Putin. He responded to this national security strategy with a tweet that read, "Our new national security strategy sounds like our 1930s foreign policy. Most Americans want a strong US role in NATO and know that China, Russia, and Iran are our adversaries." So do you agree with that? Is it similar to that?
Well, I think lots of people are drawing the parallels to the 30s and also sort of 1938, again, with trading territory for sort of peace. And I would agree. I think the actions of President Putin and the actions of Adolf Hitler are pretty similar. They were both autocratic dictators, or are autocratic dictators in Putin's case, both wanting to dominate Europe and to take territory. And I think any indication, and we've learnt it from the 30s, if you do give up land, then that encourages rather than discourages. Some people seem to be suggesting to President Zelensky, well, give up a bit of the Donbass, that will be it, and it'll be over. Now, I tend to agree with President Zelensky. If he does that, that is just the thin end of the wedge, because it is very clear that, and Putin has said this, and the French Foreign Secretary said it last week, that until Putin drops his Soviet expansionist ideas, then the chances of peace just don't exist. Because we know, as the French Foreign Minister said, that actually what Putin really wants is the whole of Ukraine and the Baltic states for starters, to try and redraw the old USSR, Soviet Union boundaries. So if he has ceded more land that he hasn't taken, and let's not forget that he has lost 1.5 million soldiers taking part of the Donbass that he's got so far. So it would be a hell of an effort for him to do it. And the UK Defence Intelligence update about a month ago suggested it would be another 1.5 million people. So, yeah, I do agree. There are worrying parallels between what we're seeing now in Europe and what we saw in the 30s, particularly 1938 and 1939. And we know that appeasement of a dictator in the 30s led to a 6-year war where millions and millions were killed across Europe and across the world, and developed into a World War II. So, one would hope that Trump is doing his history. One hope those who are advising them understand the history and are giving him correct direction, because on this side of the pond, it obviously is looking very different to what it's looking in Washington at the moment.
And just to continue honing in on that comparison, Hamish, but just for our audience to really understand, the Czech president, he spoke to the Sunday Times over the weekend, and he warned that recent speculation about these secret US-Russia negotiations and a potential handover of Ukrainian territory does resemble this logic of the Munich Agreement in 1938, as you mentioned. So in that agreement, that saw Britain and France seeking to avoid a war, basically allowed Nazi Germany to seize parts of Czechoslovakia without their consent, basically thinking that this would secure peace, but instead it emboldened Hitler and paved the way to World War II. So he makes the claim that the US, if they do hand over this Ukrainian territory to Russia, it would repeat the same catastrophic mistake and would essentially allow Putin into further expansionism, into more of Ukraine, more of Europe, that you mentioned, the Baltic states. So, I mean, if that is a fair comparison, like you and I are talking, could it potentially lead to a wider war, potentially a World War III?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the Czech president here. I think he's spot on. The similarities are frighteningly close. And if the territory, if the Donbass is ceded, if there is a ceasefire, then to me that just encourages Putin. It will have meant he will have taken about 20% of Ukraine during this war, and also when he annexed Crimea back in 2014. So why on earth would he stop? He's then going to have a year or so, or however long it is, to redevelop his military. We know that his military machine is at full power. You know, his tractor factories are turning out tanks. He's making more ammunition than the combined almost rest of the world at the moment. So if he had 2 years to build up, I mean, he would put himself in a heck of a position to be able to carry on and keep fighting. Now, what is unclear from the peace negotiations thus far are the security guarantees. And it's no accident that the German Chancellor, the French President, and the UK Prime Minister are meeting Zelensky today to talk exactly that. And those three countries have offered us security guarantees to put boots on the ground. But, you know, Putin has completely, ignored that and said that that is just not possible. You can't have a peace deal with NATO, European NATO troops in Ukraine to protect it. Of course he doesn't want that because, we go back to the Czech example in 1938, 39, that would not allow him to then regroup and start again, as it were. So, yeah, and all the sort of views coming out of Trump and his close advisors at the moment are really encouraging Putin to do that and really highlighting the issues of in the late 30s that we're talking about. So, yeah, really, really dangerous and difficult times. And let's just hope that Trump realizes the enormity of this and really get somebody to explain the history of the late 30s and what happened, which he might not fully understand at the moment.
There's been a lot of confusion over really where we're at when it comes to peace deals because there's so much back and forth. There's this delegation meeting, this meeting happening over here. There's been a lot of back and forth in the last week or so. Right now, we're not exactly privy to the complete intricacies of what a current proposal looks like. But Donald Trump, as you mentioned, Hamish, he told reporters that he's a little bit disappointed that President Zelensky hasn't read the proposal. He had it a few hours ago. His people love it, but he hasn't. Russia is, I believe, fine with it. I'm not sure that Zelensky's fine with it. His people love it, but he isn't ready. So Zelensky is reported to be briefed by his delegates today. At the same time, he's, of course, meeting with the UK, Germany, and France today. But Putin's top foreign policy aide also told Russian media that the US needs to make radical changes to this peace plan. So it's actually really hard to know where we're at with this plan and who's agreed to what.
Yeah, you're right. It's pretty confusing. I mean, let us hope this is some mercurial act by the great deal maker Trump to, unsettle the Russians and get them sort of barking down the wrong street, as it were. Now, that might well be possible, but it seems a very strange way of going about business. And we do know that Trump does seem to change his mind on a very, very regular basis, almost as the wind changes. But, that might be fair and well when you're doing property deals and business deals. But when it comes to warfare, when blood and lives are at stake, it makes it incredibly difficult. And I think, the Russians should feel that they must have a peace deal. They must have a ceasefire. Otherwise, they're going to fail completely. But everything we've heard, certainly over the last, 2 or 3 days since Friday, to me, encourages Russia, doesn't discourage them. So, this messaging, it seems strange that the Ukrainians are slapped down all the time, and the Russians are giving encouragement. I think hopefully what today's meeting with European leaders and Zelensky are going to do is an acknowledgement that Europe are actually really going to step up to the plate properly now, and they must also consider the option if Trump does completely turn away from Europe, that we've got to do the heavy lifting. And I think we need to make Trump aware of that, because I'm not sure his vanity would allow him to leave the European and the Ukraine problem to the Europeans. I think he is, we've just seen one of his wars that he stopped in between Cambodia and Thailand go up in a puff of smoke. So, he's, all the great cries about stopping wars around the world are ringing pretty hollow at the moment. So let us hope that is also in the back of his mind, because, quite frankly, what Trump decides to do now and in the future is so important. But, it's not as important to Trump as it is to the rest of us. And I think we need to be aware of that. And Europe needs to be prepared to step in, if required, from a political, diplomatic, and most importantly, a military position.
Hamish, just to kind of wrap up the land concession discussion, Trump's envoy Keith Kellogg, who, as we know, is stepping down from his post in January, he told the Reagan National Defense Forum that efforts to resolve the conflict are in the last 10 meters, emphasizing that is always the hardest part. But he spoke about the nuclear power plant and the future of Donbass. He said, if we get those two issues settled, I think the rest of things will work out fairly well. Well, we're almost there. We're really, really close. But at the same time, Ukraine is under a constitution and refuses to give up the Donbass. Zelensky also said that there are disagreements over it on all parties still. And then on the other hand, you've got Putin telling Russian media that either we liberate these territories by force of arms or Ukrainian troops leave these territories. So just so our audience understands, we're very much in the exact same place on land concessions than we've always been.
Yeah, I think we are. And General Kellogg, sadly, who seems to be one who really understands the military position and actually a lot of the other areas, as you say, is leaving. And I think that's a great shame, because Steve Witkoff, who is this real estate dealer that Trump is relying on to do this. I mean, we only saw last week when him and Jared Kushner were in Moscow, they were completely outmatched and outclassed by Putin and his team, and the fact that Kellogg's been sideways moved is a problem. But when it comes on to those those key areas, the territorial area, I don't think there is any way at all that Zelensky is going to agree to concession of the Donbass. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who don't want to be Russians, and still a lot of real estate. And when we come to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, which before the war provided a heck of a lot of power and heating to Ukraine, again, to have it illegally annexed by Russia, I would have thought it was pretty unacceptable. Ultimately, it is the Donbass that is going to decide whether this goes forward or not. And I think that is an area that really Ukraine cannot cede. I mean, it's we were talking a year ago about it not ceding Crimea and some of the other oblasts that have been taken. Now we're down to freezing the lines where they are, which to me is probably the bare minimum to have a ceasefire and a peace deal. But that's not good enough for Putin. He wants several thousand more kilometers of Ukraine, and I just don't think that's going to happen. And if Trump doesn't make Putin do that, then I think we're in a whole lot of pain. And I agree, going back to our conversation about 1938 in the Czech Republic, then that well could make this conflict develop into a much wider conflict across Europe and possibly further on as well.
Amy, she mentioned 1.5 million Russian troops have been killed since the start of the war. Now, an interesting article has come out that basically said that Russia has stepped up its recruitment of foreign fighters through targeted social media campaigns. These are mostly being done out of Telegram. So they're promising a few things. They're promising Russian citizenship. They're promising non-combat roles. It says that you will be placed in a safer, supported role. But military analysts, of course, as your face would indicate, Hamish, that is quite deceptive. So the recruitments have increased from around 100 per month in early 2024 to around 4,500 per month now. So it's mostly targeting people in Central Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, offering large sign-on bonuses and higher monthly salaries. So it's reported there's around 18,000 foreigners across 128 countries that have joined since the war began. But this tactic, Hamish, does it surprise you? But also, does it show how desperate Putin is, given how his soldiers are dwindling?
I think there are two key things to unpack here, Maddie. First of all, I think it shows how desperate the Russians are. I mean, they are still, we understand, losing 1,000 people a day, particularly in the Donbass, trying to take Petrovsk and areas like that. Although Russia is a big country, it just can't sustain, having lost 1.5 million already. I think the other interesting point that is for this and current Russian conscripts or native Russian conscripts is the amount of money on offer. Now, a Russian soldier gets paid about double the national wage. A lot of money, and which is why people have gone to the front. Yeah, I think the fact that Russia is offering so much money for soldiers, that it's not unsurprising that poor countries in Africa and the Far East are signing up in great numbers to do this. Double the national wage. I mean, it's one of the reasons we've discussed before that why the babushkas and mothers of Russia have not marched on the Kremlin as they did in the 80s when Russia lost 17,000 people in Afghanistan, forcing the then Russian government to withdraw from Afghanistan. We're now well over 1 million, and they're not doing that. And the reason is because people see them as mercenaries. They're paid a fortune, and if Russian soldiers are killed on the front line, their family are paid a fortune. So people, that's why they're getting on with it. But the fact that Russia now has to troll the world to find cannon fodder, if you like, to go into the meat grinder is bizarre. And as you say, being offered soft rolls at the back, well, ask the North Koreans, that didn't really stick. They were promised nice cushy jobs in the back, and 11,000 of them also were killed, so I understand.
Hamish, I want to read out a few stats from this recent poll. It's a Reagan National Defense Survey. It shows that 64% of Americans now favor the US sending lethal aid to Ukraine, the highest level since Russia's full-scale invasion. It's jumped 9% since this time last year. So here's some of the stats. 65% support giving Ukraine long-range missiles, 68% back selling US weapons to European allies that can help Ukraine, 69% favor a NATO-style collective defense commitment to Ukraine, 74% support a demilitarized zone with the US and European air support. Around 45% of Americans favor Ukraine regaining all of its territory, while the smaller shares support trading territory for peace and opting for a ceasefire. While in a separate poll, 51% of Americans think that any peace deal forcing Ukraine to give up territory or restrict its military size is unacceptable. 74% of US respondents said it matters that Ukraine defends its sovereignty against Russian aggression. So, I mean, Hamish, this speaks volumes. This poll is saying that Americans more than ever before since the invasion in 2022 want Donald Trump, want the Trump administration to help out, sending military, helping out with intelligence, whether it's sending help to NATO and European allies that will in turn send it to Ukraine, whatever it may be. But my question for you is, right now in this situation of where we're at in the war, and this survey speaks volumes, these two surveys, what would you recommend for the US to send to Ukraine in terms of weaponry and intelligence?
Well, I think first of all, this is really refreshing. I think the view that we get this side of the Atlantic is the US people are not interested in Ukraine. they're insular and they just want to get on with things. And that is the sort of message that President Trump has been saying for a while. So let's hope he sees these results and it really fits in. I mean, I know it's an awful long way till the next election in the US, and he's probably not too worried about it. But let us hope that America is the great democracy, and if that's what the people want, let's hope that their government sort of take due notice to that. I think when it comes to munitions and stuff, we know that Europe is already buying key bits of weaponry. But unfortunately, during the Biden era, although some weaponry a lot of weaponry was given, it came with a lot of caveats. And I think, first of all, that whatever caveats are left, with particularly the use of long-range precision-guided missiles, those caveats should be taken off, because we've seen how effective it has been when Ukraine's been able to attack deep into Russia, hitting their power infrastructure, pretty much writing down their fuel production industry, which is having a huge impact to normal Russians. So I'd like to see the caveats off. We've talked before about the cruise missiles, and cruise missiles are an interesting factor here. Some experts will say, well, they're just a single weapon. But psychologically, I mean, the only time the Russians talked about any sort of concession were a few months ago, when it was possible that Donald Trump was going to give Tomahawk missiles, and lots of them, to the Ukrainians. Now, President Putin and his advisors realized that could have a huge impact. I mean, these cruise missiles that the Russians seem unable to stop, there was the spectre of them going through the windows of the Kremlin. In fact, Trump even said to Zelensky, are you going to post one through the Kremlin? So although the Tomahawk missiles might not be the great game changer that perhaps some suggest, psychologically I think they are. And I think if they're given in sufficient numbers, and I'm talking about hundreds and thousands here, not tens and twenties, then I think that would have a huge difference, allied to the US intelligence that is required for the processing of the targets. Allied to that, I think NATO, or certainly European NATO countries, must look very seriously and demonstrate they're serious about providing some sort of air cover, particularly for Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. We've seen the power industry hit. We've seen the Chernobyl nuclear power station hit recently, and actually the sarcophagus that is protecting the damaged reactor is damaged, and could start spreading contamination around Ukraine and Europe again. So these critical bits of civilian infrastructure, I emphasize civilian, should be protected. And if Ukraine can't do it themselves, there are hundreds of fourth generation stealth fighters like the F-35As and Bs that Europe has that could be used to protect those civilians' infrastructure. So I think that there is a heck of a lot that can be done. And the most important part of it is the psychological part, to make sure that Putin understands that.
It's a bittersweet end to the year, Scott. Just for the audience to know, you're my last guest before I go home, and you've been a crowd favorite. So it's good to have you on, because we've had so much news really catered towards your expertise, actually. So I want to start off with what happened late on Thursday. House Oversight Democrats have released multiple photos from Jeffrey Epstein's estate on the eve of the 30-day deadline for the DOJ to release any information and documents that they have in their possession. So we saw the release of around 19 photos last week, and then we've seen some photos released on Thursday. So Scott, your reaction to seeing the latest photos, what was the worst of it?
I mean, I think this was the third photo drop that the Democrats in the House Oversight Committee have done as we move up towards this deadline today, to actually see the criminal case files of Jeffrey Epstein. The drop yesterday, I think we need to start with the fact Donald Trump is nowhere in the photo drop yesterday. He has been mentioned in previous drops and in the Epstein emails. We just simply wait to see what comes out in the full files. But even though Trump wasn't there, there's some interesting context that comes out of the photos. Multiple photos of Epstein, of course, in his residences, in the apartment, and then of people who are around Epstein, or who basically drop in whether it's for business, whether it's socially. And it's a range of names. And you have to say this goes back to how well connected Epstein was, how he liked to collect people around him as he tried to network. So Bill Gates is there with an unidentified woman whose face is redacted, so she can't be named. And it's like, okay, we know that Bill Gates' marriage broke in part because of that connection with Epstein. What does that add? There's no context. None of these photos have any context around them, so you just simply have what you have there. Noam Chomsky, who, full disclosure, used to be a major influence on both my academic work and then on my political work, until I sort of got a bit disillusioned with him. Noam Chomsky is there, even though he is like this figure on the left who is always critical of American corporate power, is critical of American foreign policy. And here he is basically alongside Epstein, and in addition to emails that establish their correspondence. And then you get David Brooks, who won't be as well known, I think, in the UK, but he's a very prominent New York Times columnist who only a few weeks ago was writing a column about Epstein and effectively was saying, look, really, is there that much here that we need to be discussing? Aren't we overdoing this? And lo and behold, David Brooks shows up at an event where Epstein is. The New York Times had to issue a clarification yesterday to say, well, he was just there covering this business event, and so on. But the point is, it was in, I think, 2011, which was after the first criminal cases against Epstein over the pedophilia, which were in Florida. So, I think it's a wider story about American society and about American power that came out. That won't satisfy those who want to get the closure on Trump, but in a wider sense, I think you and I have always emphasized this story of Epstein and his pedophilia has this troubling connection with how American power operates. And as you try to get justice and closure for the victims, we need identification not just of Trump if he is implicated. We need identification of anybody who was in a position of influence who abused that position, as well as abusing these girls.
And that's kind of the premise of where we're at, Scott, because if you and I discussed at great lengths, what Thomas Massey, the Republican congressman, as we said, has emphasized is that he's seen victims' testimony, he's seen the allegations of those who they've named. And so his argument is that the DOJ must release these files to name high-profile people that these victims have said abuse them, and that, the rich don't get away with this, the powerful don't get away with this. So that's the whole point of why House Oversight Democrats are drip-feeding these photos. They're trying to keep the headlines in the public eye so that we don't keep the pressure off those that might be named, off the Department of Justice, off the Trump administration, because they're just in power right now. So you mentioned these high profile people that were named in the latest drop. So yes, Bill Gates, Noam Chomsky, Woody Allen again, Steve Bannon again, they're all pictured. Just to emphasize, there is no criminal wrongdoing pictured in these latest batch of photos, but at the very least, it kind of puts them in a bad light, Scott.
Yeah, it does. And I want to add one dimension that I think I found most troubling, which may not grab that many headlines because there's no famous person specifically named here. There is passport information, which is, and it's heavily redacted for obvious reasons, but these passports appear to be of at least young women, because the one case I looked at yesterday was an 18-year-old who moved from Russia into the Schengen area and then to the U.S. And so these young women, maybe girls, were being moved, and then there's a screen grab of a text exchange, which
I'm going to read it out. Scott, I'm going to interrupt you. Read it out and get your reaction.
You go ahead and read that out for us.
Yeah, so this is the WhatsApp exchange. We don't know who really it's from and who to, but it says, I don't know, try to send someone else. I have a friend Scout. She sent me some girls today, but asks $1,000 per girl. I will send you girls now. Maybe someone will be good for Jay. And then it says name, redacted, 18-year-old, redacted, height, redacted, measurements, redacted, weight, redacted, departure city, Russia.
Yeah, and it actually mentions went through the Schengen area, so therefore went from Russia through somewhere on continental Europe and then to the United
Schengen
States.
tip.
And so that's trafficking. That appears to be trafficking of young women. For $1,000 apiece to move them across. It's not proven, but we assume that J refers to Epstein as his first initial. Now, look, if there's more like this in the files, what you have is you start to have a trail, which connects, of course, Epstein to the girls or maybe young women. I'm being careful here because there's the age of consent that we could talk about, but they're being moved across, and that just highlights the importance of all of the files that we await, because we're talking here not just about screen grabs from WhatsApp. We're not just talking about the photos. We could be talking about witness statements. We could be talking about depositions of even of those who might be suspected of criminal activity, and audio, video. And what the Republican Thomas Massey said, who has really stood up against Trump and demanded the release of these files, is Massey says, look, if you look in these files, he says 20. He thinks he's got 20 high-profile men who can be identified here, either through the men being named in these files or, interestingly enough, through their lawyers. Because, of course, what would have happened here is if these men were suspected, the contact between the Justice Department may have been with their lawyers regarding, okay, what's the process in terms of the investigation? So there's going to be all kinds of trails that are going to have to be chased, which is sort of a cautionary note on two accounts. First of all, we may not get all the files today. We think we are going to get some files because House Democrats were saying yesterday they believe they will come out. But the Justice Department was letting it be known that they're scrambling to carry out all the redactions. Whether you believe that's real or excuse. But beyond that, even if we did get all the files today, there's going to have to be a lot of investigative work because this is raw material to connect the dots in terms of what leads where, which means a lot of caution. We know powerful men need to be identified if they're culpable, but people need to avoid jumping the gun before we've got hard evidence.
I couldn't agree with you more, Scott. And just for our audience, because they know that you and I will go through these things, we always do an analysis anytime there's something dropped, but from the Epstein files or anything from the oversight committee. But we probably won't have the opportunity to do that because, as you said, it's going to take time. We don't know how many documents. There could be thousands and thousands of documents that drop. It will take time to go through them. But one of the cause for concerns has been how much will be redacted. So as we said, the DOJ, the Attorney General Pam Bondi, she must release files today from the Department of Justice. But we are expecting there to be some redactions, whether it be due to national security concerns about sex trafficking, or it could be because perhaps they'll say that there are open investigations into some of the things. So what do you think will happen in terms of these redactions?
I think we need to make a distinction between two different, effectively, causes for redaction. And one of these causes is absolutely legitimate. And that is, look, if you've got girls who are named in these files, girls, and they will now be women, you've got to protect their identities. They've suffered enough. You don't need them being outed, right? If you've got witnesses to these events, which could be criminal events, they need to be protected. There are security concerns which take place there. If you've got names of people who are not implicated in criminal activity, let's say people who happen to know Epstein and so on, if there's something that could give the misleading impression that they're involved in a crime, you've got to protect that. And that's legitimate. And I've dealt with that in a series of other cases over the years. What you're talking about on the second level, however, of redaction is to cover someone's backside. And that is, you redact information because you don't want someone's name to come out. And of course, Trump is one of the names that we talk about. And that's absolutely illegitimate. And I think what's going to happen here is as the files come out, you're going to see different groups trying to sift through this. You're going to see, obviously, I think Democrats, as well as people like Thomas Massey, Marjorie Taylor Greene, another Republican opponent of Trump on this, who are going to go through to say, are the redactions justified? Then you're going to have journalists going through it to see, if there's justification. And then you're going to have lawyers going through it here because, of course, there may be cause for further action from these files that come out. Now, I will say one overall sweeping thing. If the Justice Department comes out and says, look, we had to carry out redactions because we have ongoing investigations, that is a huge red flag, because I want to make this clear. All investigations into Epstein's pedophilia had been effectively resolved at the end of 2024 with the Ghislaine Maxwell case being resolved. Now, you can make the argument that there should have been more criminal cases pursued. We could talk about that. But in terms of the reason why the files could be released in 2025 is because there were no open investigations. We know that Donald Trump ordered Pam Bondi to go after his political opponents by saying, open an investigation on Bill Clinton, open an investigation on Bill Gates, open an investigation on Reid Hoffman, who is the LinkedIn co-founder and a big donor to the Democratic Party. Now, there is no basis that we know of to open those investigations, absolutely none. So if justice uses that as an excuse today, they are covering for Trump or other people by using his enemies as their pretext, as their cover.
Let's get into this New York Times article, Scott. So just for our audience to understand, on the eve of the DOJ having to release these files, the New York Times wrote it was a large, detailed article where they interviewed former staffers of Jeffrey Epstein. I think they interviewed around 30. So here's just a summary of what they said. So this is in regards to the friendship between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. So through sources, they said that the article reads that they pursued women in a game of ego and dominance. Female bodies were currency. One source described it as trophy hunting, a pissing contest who had the most women. Multiple sources described frequent contact and explicit sex talk, including phone calls at least 3 times a week between Trump and Epstein. Trump is described by one former assistant as Epstein's most reliable wingman and recalls Trump regaling Mr. Epstein with tales of his sexual exploits. So, I mean, your reaction to this?
Look, I will give you the hook line for this. The only thing that is saving Donald Trump at this point, politically and legally, is the age of consent. That's the only thing that's saving him. Because, and again, you know, our viewers will know this, there is that distinction between a young woman and a girl. Now, others have testified over the years that Trump was always with young women, not girls, right? So he was always on the right side of the age of the consent. And we have to make it clear for the record, there is no evidence out there that I know of, and I hasten to be corrected, that Trump had sexual relations with someone who was below the age of consent, although he was in the presence of girls with Epstein. We also need to make that clear. Now, what you get from this testimony from the sturdy staff is that Trump had absolutely no limits, no compunctions in terms of the young women he pursued. We know this from multiple other cases, however, regarding Trump. We know it from the way that he ran the Miss America and the Miss Universe pageants. We actually know this from the way that he acted on The Apprentice, on his reality TV show. We know it from the fact that more than 20 women, and I will have to double check my numbers, but at least more than 20 of them have accused him of sexual abuse, sometimes amounting to sexual assault. We know that he has been convicted of defamation with respect to a case of sexual assault in which a judge called it tantamount to rape. So we know Donald Trump's record of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and we know that he bragged about it because a year after he supposedly fell out with Epstein over a property deal in 2005, he's on the Access Hollywood tape bragging to, Billy Bush, who hosted this entertainment program, about grabbing women. And we won't repeat the rest of that. So we know all this. What has been interesting, just to cut to the chase here, is Donald Trump has been able to slide on this, partly because of the devotion of his supporters, and partly because there is a troubling fallback in American society, more than a decade after Me Too, which actually rationalizes, justifies, and excuses violence against women.
And I just want to emphasize that this New York Times article doesn't have any source in it that accuses Trump of any wrongdoing or shows any proof of any wrongdoing from the president. However, one source said that Epstein introduced himself as Trump's best friend. And then part of the article reads, Mr. Epstein and his partner Ghislaine Maxwell introduced at least 6 women who have accused them of grooming or abuse to Mr. Trump. One was a minor at the time. None have accused Mr. Trump himself of inappropriate behavior.
Yeah, but again, I think this summarizes exactly where we are here, which is Donald Trump was really close to Jeffrey Epstein. He was really close to Epstein. The only reason why Trump falls out with Epstein, and we can put this all together, is it is not because Epstein was taking girls who worked at Mar-a-Lago. We know from Epstein's email that the indication is Trump knew about that. So from Epstein's point of view, that is not why they fell out. The best evidence we have is they fell out because they competed for a big property deal down in Florida, which interestingly enough, and I need to check this out, maybe that infamous Palm Beach mansion that was later purchased by the Russians in effectively what might have been a money laundering case. I'll leave that to the side for the moment. What we have here is that Trump was in the company of Epstein up until at least 2004, 2005, and there were girls who were present. We do not know the relationship, the extent of that relationship between the girls and Donald Trump. But there's a second level, Maddie, here that has not been emphasized, but comes out because of what you and I talked earlier about these photos. Was Trump in the presence of young women who had been trafficked? Even though those women are above the age of consent, if they have been trafficked, and if he has any knowledge that they may have been trafficked, then he also faces liability.
And that's a question that's not isolated just to Trump. That's a question that will be for anyone in Epstein's orbit, anyone that denies any wrongdoing but was kind of present for these trafficked women, trafficked girls that were there and either turned a blind eye or didn't raise questions with Jeffrey Epstein. And that's we'll put that question to a side until we see more information as these, hopefully, DOJ documents are released today. But let's move on to something else happening today, which is that, well, late last night, EU leaders, they held a summit yesterday in Brussels. They were trying to lobby Belgium to release tens of billions of euros worth of frozen Russian assets that were confiscated when the invasion began. So Belgium had been apprehensive, worrying that they would be retaliated against by Russia. However, EU leaders finished the summit by agreeing to borrow a cash loan of up to 19 billion euros to Ukraine to fund its defense against Russia for the next 2 years, rather than use these frozen assets. So the president of the European Commission has tweeted saying that we have a deal decision to provide 90 billion euros of support to Ukraine for 2026, 2027, approved, we committed, we delivered. I mean, Scott, it's not exactly the outcome we wanted, but what sort of lifeline has these EU leaders just handed Ukraine?
You know, Maddie, it's hard sometimes to make economics and financial stories dramatic, and it can be really hard to make the European Union's bureaucracy dramatic, but this may be, in fact, I think it is one of the most dramatic moments in Ukraine's 47-month resistance against Russia's full-scale invasion. The fundamental here is that to maintain that resistance against Russia's invasion, and I don't think there will be a ceasefire because Vladimir Putin wants more Ukrainian territory. He wants to break the country. He wants to keep it weak. So that means you have to continue to defend Ukraine, and that includes not just military defense, but its financial needs. Keeping the government running, keeping public services running, providing transportation, education, healthcare. And the estimated cost for the next 2 years through 2027 is 135 billion euros, right? So the EU's initial idea was that you were going to finance this through what's called a reparations loan. Now, that reparations loan would be drawn from frozen Russian assets because the Russians are liable for all the damage they've caused Ukraine since February 2022. And I think that would have gone through, except the sticking point is that Belgium holds about 88% of Russian assets, and a lot of those are held through a Belgian company called Euroclear. And the Russians threatened Belgium. They said, look, if you agree to this reparations loan, you know, we're going to, in fact, they filed lawsuits. They've already filed, I think, a $230 billion lawsuit against Euroclear. They have been reportedly intimidating Euroclear officials and Belgian government officials. That's according to European intelligence agencies. And at the same time, the United States, the Trump administration made the threat to the EU, look, if you approve this reparations loan, we will get that money back. I think because they're protecting future U.S.-Russian economic projects. Anyway, all of that meant that Belgium took a hard line and would not agree to the reparations loan. And if Belgium doesn't agree to it, you can't go ahead with it. And at that point, you're thinking, that's it, man. Ukraine is stranded. When this was developing a few weeks ago, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission head, said, all right, look, we'll take some of the money from a reparations loan, but we'll borrow some of the money, right? We'll effectively find it from other sources. And what happened here last night is that idea took hold, which is, all right, if you can't get the reparations loan, let's provide 90 billion euros, about 2/3 of what Ukraine needs over the next 2 years, through a loan against our budget, right? In other words, we will find it from our member states and we will keep Ukraine going. The barrier to that had been, and the reason why the EU had not done that before is the fear that it would be vetoed by one of Putin's friends, especially Viktor Orban in Hungary, possibly Robert Fico in Slovakia. In the end, as he has done on multiple occasions, Orban did not follow through with the threat to veto. We don't know what incentives he got, if he got any incentives not to veto. We know that he's boasting to his public this morning that Hungary, as well as Slovakia and the Czech Republic, don't have to contribute to that loan. So he's like, yay, I saved us money. All right, big damn deal, Orban. That doesn't matter. The other 24 states have agreed that 90 billion euro loan. And as Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, said last night, this is a victory for our resistance. This is a victory for resilience. We can keep going. Because, again, you and I have just talked about Ukraine on multiple levels. And the level that this comes down to is you have to have money to resist an invasion, but you also have to have money to carry out an invasion. And we have the juxtaposition of Ukraine getting support from Europe. If Vladimir Putin continues to have a plunge in his oil revenues, which will be cut by almost 50% by the end of this year, and if the U.S. does not roll back sanctions, who's going to finance Vlad? Who's going to bail him out to keep his invasion going?
There's been these questions over where EU leaders will get this money from. The ideal situation, as I mentioned, would be that Russia starts the war, Russia pays for the war, but that hasn't been the situation, as you mentioned. And I think it's interesting to talk about why Belgium blocked it, because when I had Bill Browder on the show yesterday, he believes that Belgium is blocking it due to safety concerns for the head of Euroclear, as you said, and Belgium's PM believing that there was probably threats on their lives if they were to carry through with this. But the Kremlin are gloating about the fact that EU leaders didn't agree unanimously to use these frozen assets. So Kirill Dmitriev, he tweeted, Scott, he said, major blow to EU warmongers, led by failed Ursula, voices of reason in the EU blocked the illegal use of Russian reserves to fund Ukraine. Law and sanity win for now. I mean, regardless, 90 billion euros is going straight into the hands of Ukraine to continue fighting, to continue this offensive, to continue the fact that they want to win this war on their own terms. So, Scott, I mean, when we see this gloating from Kirill Dmitriev, is it almost as if Putin's worried?
Absolutely. You know, at one level, I don't give a flying fig what Kirill Dmitriev says, because Kirill Dmitriev, like others in the Kremlin inner circle, are spinning propaganda and trying to get the media to bite on all their misinformation and disinformation. At another level, I'll play the connected dots for you. What has happened in the past, well, in late October, Kirill Dmitriev, the same person you just quoted, he thought he had sealed the deal with the Trump administration to break Ukraine, because he was the guy who was in Florida working out that 28-point ultimatum with the real estate developer, Steve Witkoff, who is supposedly an envoy, and with Donald Trump's very real son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And that ultimatum, remind you, was like, okay, let's give more Ukrainian territory to Russia, the Donetsk region in the east of the country. Let's keep Ukraine militarily and economically weak, effectively partitioning the country and limiting Western aid. And you know what? Kirill Dmitriev and Vladimir Putin didn't get that through. The Europeans and Ukraine pushed back. And as I speak to you, We've come out of meetings in Berlin where for the first time the Europeans and Kyiv have gotten a plan for U.S. as well as European and international security guarantees. If we halt the invasion, there is a full plan now for European troops inside Ukraine, for the U.S. to lead the air support to protect Ukraine against a further Russian attack. So what's the Kremlin going to have to do now? Oh, heck. They're sending Kirill Dmitriev back out to Florida this weekend to meet the real estate developer, Steve Witkoff, at his club, probably outside Miami, because the Kremlin have to try to bounce the Trump administration again. Don't give these security guarantees. Don't make a ceasefire. Give us territory. So what Dmitriev is trying to do is, you notice he will not insult the U.S., nor will Vladimir Putin insult the U.S. They're trying to win the United States back by saying Europe has no role here. Because just before Dmitriev said, oh yeah, Europe, blah, 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 that 90 billion euros, yeah, what does that matter? What matters, mate, is it's 90 billion euros. Vladimir Putin gets out there and he's got his general, Gerasimov, the guy who screwed up the invasion, beside him. And he's going, oh, what can Europe do about this? They're all just simply Nazis. They're all little pigs. So apparently Europe has become Nazi piglets, right? That's guys who are thumping their chest to try to project that they're the strong people when they're covering up a position of possible weakness. We're going to go into the winter, and the Kremlin are going to make their big effort to break Ukraine's energy infrastructure. They're going to try to break Ukraine financially. They're going to try to break them on the front lines. But if Europe stands firm behind Ukraine and other countries, hi Canada, they wonder if they can do that. They really wonder if they've got the space to do that. And so I'm going to repeat something to you that I said to Ukrainian journalist yesterday, Maddie, if you don't mind, because I garbled the quote. So I'm going to get it right for you here. In February 2022, Vladimir Putin, Kirill Dmitriev, Dmitry Medvedev, who may or may not have been sober at the time, and other folks thought, we are going to launch this full-scale invasion and we'll be within Kyiv within weeks, if not days. They had special forces at Hostomel Airport, just outside Kyiv. And you know what? Ukraine didn't break. Vladimir Zelensky, I'm going to get the quote right this time, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. Ukraine's government did not flee. They were not captured. Ukraine's military did not break. And most importantly, Ukrainians did not break. And what we saw yesterday was that the European Union, in its own cumbersome, bureaucratic, sometimes too slow way, recognized and maintained its support for those Ukrainians. We don't know if Donald Trump will. We don't know if J.D. Vance will. We don't know if Steve Witkoff will. But Europe did. And that is important. So yeah, Ukraine still stands, and Kirill Dmitriev goes to Florida, and I hope he can top up on his suntan in a Florida winter. And I hope Steve Witkoff doesn't have a Steve Witkoff lapse and decide to become Vladimir Putin's best buddy yet again.
Well, what a year it has been. Thank you so much for watching and joining us throughout 2025. Once again, have a lovely festive break, and I'll see you in 2026.